Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. The chair in the corner of my study has always been just a chair. It is an old thing, inherited from a grandfather I never met. Its dark oak frame worn smooth in places by the slow, patient friction of time. The crimson velvet of its seat is faded to the color of a dried bloodstain, and the two carved finials at the top of its back are worn into the shape of blind, polished eyes. For 10 years, it held my coats, my discarded books, the quiet weight of my neglect. But tonight, as the city outside my window hums with a fever it does not yet understand, the chair is no longer just a chair. It holds a posture of patient expectation. It is waiting for someone to sit in it, and the shape it anticipates is not my own. It began with whispers on the wind, a story too outlandish for the front page, relegated to the digital gutters where conspiracy blooms. A new form of anemia, they said, a citywide fatigue. People were becoming sensitive to light, their pallor waxy and translucent. They complained of a constant metallic taste in their mouths, as if they were sucking on old pennies. I am Dr. Bonnie Corrigan, an epidemiologist with the CDC. And my first instinct was to look for a contaminant in the water supply, a novel heavy metal leaching from forgotten pipes. That was the normality, the world we understood. But normality is a skin, and it tears so very easily. The first true omen came to me not in a report, but in a smell. I was in the morgue, the air a sterile cocktail of bleach and decay, standing over the body of a young woman named Sarah Flynn. Her chart listed cause of death as acute hemolytic shock, but her veins were not just empty. They were desiccated, as if something had not just drunk her blood, but had consumed every last molecule of moisture, leaving her tissues like ancient parchment. "See here," a voice rasped beside me. I hadn't heard him approach. He was a tall, gaunt man in a long coat that smelled of dust and dried herbs. Gerald, he said his name was. He was not on the official roster. His fingers, long and skeletal, pointed not at the Y incision, but at the woman's neck. Just below the hairline, almost invisible, were two punctures. They were not the fang marks of Hollywood. They were tiny, precise, like the bites of an insect, but surrounded by a faint, web-like pattern of broken capillaries that pulsed with a faint, bruise-like luminescence under the morgue lights. "It's not a disease, doctor," he whispered, his breath a ghost of cloves and grave dirt. "It's a harvest." The authorities were slow, mired in protocol and politics. They wanted a virus, a bacterium, a neat little box to put their terror in. They did not want Gerald's stories, his ancient, leather-bound books filled with bestiaries of things that slept in the earth and drank the light from the world. He spoke of the upure, not the vampires of romance, but a parasitic consciousness, an ancient thing that propagated not through bite, but through a kind of spiritual resonance, a song sung in a frequency only the dying can hear. The infected, he called them the thinned. They were not undead. They were emptied, their humanity siphoned out, replaced by a singular, ravenous purpose, to make room for the ancient one stirring in the city's forgotten places. The city tightened around us like a fist. The calm moments became fleeting, precious deceptions. You would see a family having a picnic in the dwindling sunset, and for a moment, the world was sane. Then you would notice that their eyes did not squint against the light, that their movements were too synchronized, that the basket between them remained unopened. The air began to taste of ozone and rust. The sound of the city changed. The familiar symphony of traffic and life was gradually replaced by a lower, more insistent hum. The sound of a million whispers just below the threshold of hearing. We gathered in my apartment, a small, desperate band. There was Leo, a nurse who had seen too much in the overwhelmed hospitals. Maria, a quiet librarian whose brother had been among the first to vanish. And Gerald, our reluctant prophet of doom. My study became our war room. Maps were spread across the floor, dotted with pins marking outbreaks of the anemia. And always in the corner was that chair. I began to find myself looking at it more than the maps. In the dead of night, I would wake from a fever dream of running through lightless tunnels, and my eyes would go directly to it, convinced I would see a silhouette seated there, waiting. It was just a chair. It was always just a chair, but the space it occupied felt heavier, denser, as if it were a hole punched through reality into something colder and older. The revelation came on a night when the rain fell in thick, greasy sheets. We had tracked the epicenter of the outbreak to the old river tunnels, a labyrinth of brick and shadow that ran beneath the city's foundations. We went down there, armed with Gerald's archaic symbols, carved into oak stakes, and the cold, rational fear of my UV lamps. The darkness was not an absence of light, but a substance. It pressed against our goggles, thick and velvety, and it smelled of wet stone and something else, something sweetly rotten, like forgotten flowers in a sealed room. We found them there, the thinned. They were not snarling or monstrous. They stood in silent rows, their faces upturned, their mouths slightly open. They were listening, and from the depths of the tunnel, a sound echoed. A vibration more than a noise. A low, resonant frequency that made the fillings in my teeth ache and the bones of my skull hum. It was the song Gerald had described. It was the sound of the Ancient One calling its children home. We saw it then, a shape coalescing from the deeper shadows. It was not a man. It was a concept given form, a rend in the fabric of things. It had too many angles, and its movement was a liquid wrongness that defied the eye. It was the source of the song, the conductor of this silent, starving orchestra. It had no need for fangs or claws. Its presence was the infection. To be near, it was to feel your own selfhood thinning, your memories, your loves, your fears, all siphoned away to feed its vast, ancient hunger. We fled, our rationality shattered, our weapons feeling like toys. We did not fight a war that night. We witnessed a sacrament. Back in the relative safety of my apartment, the world outside was coming apart. Sirens wailed in a continuous, hopeless lament. The power grids were failing sector by sector, plunging the city into a darkness that was no longer empty. We were gathered in my study, the five of us, breathing in the shared air of our defeat. Gerald was chanting something low in a language that hurt my ears. Leo was silently crying. Maria stared out the window at the dying lights. And I looked at the chair. It was no longer waiting. The air around it shimmered, like heat haze over asphalt. The faint, web-like pattern I had seen on Sarah Flynn's neck began to manifest on the air itself, a luminous, bruise-colored tracery. The smell of ozone and rust was overpowering. The hum, the terrible, resonant hum of the song from the tunnels, was now in this room with us. It was not coming from outside. It was emanating from the chair. The climax was not a battle. It was an arrival. The space within the frame of the chair deepened, swallowing the light. The carved finials at the top of the back ceased to be wood and became actual eyes, pupilless and ancient, the color of a starless midnight. They regarded us with a passive, cosmic hunger. The thing from the tunnels had not followed us home. It had been here all along, This was its nest. This quiet, forgotten piece of furniture in the corner of my life was a conduit, a fixed point through which it could seep into our world. The outbreak wasn't spreading through the city. The city was being absorbed by this single patient point of entry. Gerald let out a choked cry and lunged forward with his stake. He did not even reach the chair. He simply thinned. His form lost coherence, his outline blurring, his substance dissolving into a faint, shimmering mist that was drawn into the waiting darkness of the seat. He was gone without a sound. Leo screamed and ran for the door. He made it 2 steps before the same fate took him, his cry cut short, his body unraveling into nothing. Maria was next, then the others, one by one, their lives siphoned away into the patient, hungry silence of the chair. I was the last. I stood frozen, not in fear, but in a terrible, awestruck understanding. We had been fighting a symptom. The disease was right here. It had been my silent companion for a decade. The humming filled my skull. I could feel it in my cells, a vibration that was loosening my very atoms. I looked at the chair, at those ancient, starless eyes, and I knew it saw me. It knew the shape of my bones, the rhythm of my heart, the secret fears I whispered to myself in the dark. It had always known. My hand rose, not of my own volition, and reached toward it. I was not afraid anymore. The fear had been thinned away. There was only the song and the profound, empty peace of surrender. The chair in the corner of my study has always been just a chair. It is an old thing, inherited from a grandfather I never met. Its dark oak frame worn smooth in places by the slow, patient friction of time. The crimson velvet of its seat is faded to the color of a dried bloodstain, and the 2 carved finials at the top of its back are worn into the shape of blind, polished eyes. For 10 years it held my coats, my discarded books, the quiet weight of my neglect. But tonight, as the city outside my window hums with a fever it does not yet understand, the chair is no longer just a chair. It holds a posture, a patient expectation. It is waiting for someone to sit in it, and the shape it anticipates is not my own. It is yours. Come closer. Listen. Can you hear the song? My fingers were an inch from the velvet, the air so thick it felt like pushing through water. The song was not a sound in my ears anymore. It was a vibration in the marrow. A resonance that promised an end to questions, to pain, to the weary burden of being Bonnie Corrit. The city's final screams were a distant, irrelevant murmur. Here, in this room, there was only the hum and the waiting dark. Then, the phone rang. The sound was a shard of glass in the eye of a dream. It was the landline, an old beige relic I kept for emergencies, its corded receiver sitting on my desk. It shouldn't have worked. The power was out. The cell networks were dead. But it rang, a shrill, mechanical bell that cut through the resonant hum with the violence of a physical blow. The ancient eyes in the chair flickered. For a fraction of a second, the humming stuttered. It was not a sound of anger, but of annoyance. A cosmic irritation at this mundane, impossible interruption. My hand, which had been reaching for the void, trembled and fell to my side. The spell was broken, not by strength, but by absurdity. I stumbled back, my body my own again, shaking with the aftershock of near dissolution. The phone continued to ring, each ring a lifeline thrown from a world that was supposed to be gone. I lunged for the desk, my movements clumsy and human. I fumbled the receiver to my ear. Hello? My voice was a dry rasp. There was a burst of static, then a voice tinny and distant, but unmistakably real. Bonnie? It's Alan, from the CDC lab in Atlanta. He sounded breathless, terrified. The samples you sent, we isolated it. It's not a pathogen. It's a particle. A Bose-Einstein condensate held in a state of quantum superposition. It doesn't infect cells. It rewrites local reality. It thins the barrier between what is and what might be, or what was. I stared at the chair. The web-like pattern in the air pulsed with a faint, angry light. The humming was returning, building again, trying to swallow the voice on the phone. "Alan, it's here," I whispered, my lips numb. "It's in my study." "I know. The readings are... It's a focal point, a node. But Bonnie, listen, if it's a quantum state, it can be collapsed. It needs an observer, a specific resonant observer to fully manifest. That's what the song is, a tuning fork for a compatible consciousness. You have to break the resonance." "How?" The word was a plea. The static on the line grew louder, swallowing his voice. "Disrupt the observation. Introduce chaos." A wrong note. His voice broke up completely, then returned for one last, desperate burst. "It's not a monster, Bonnie. It's a signal. And you can change the station." The line went dead. The dial tone was a flat, empty sound. The humming was back at full strength, a physical pressure in the room. The darkness within the chair swirled, agitated. It was done waiting. It began to pull, not just at my body, but at my attention, demanding I look, I acknowledge, I complete the observation it needed to become fully, irrevocably real. Alan's words echoed in the screaming silence of my mind. A wrong note. My eyes darted around the room, past the maps and the scattered books, and landed on a small, battery-powered radio on a shelf. A final, foolish preparation for a storm that never came. I stumbled toward it, my legs heavy as lead. The pull from the chair was immense, a riptide trying to drag my gaze back into its depth. I focused on the radio, my fingers fumbling over the knobs. I turned it on. A blast of static. Then a fragment of a pop song from a decade ago, cheery and mindless. The humming from the chair wavered. The pop song cut out, replaced by a frantic news broadcaster listing safe zones that no longer existed. Another waver. I spun the dial, my hand shaking violently, sending a chaotic cascade of noise through the room. A preacher's sermon, a sports commentary, a commercial for a furniture warehouse, more static. Each sound was a pebble thrown into a still, dark pond. The entity in the chair recoiled from the dissonance. The perfect, resonant hum of its song was being corrupted, muddied by the meaningless cacophony of a dying world. The darkness in the chair rippled, its form becoming less certain. The ancient eyes blinked, for a moment showing not infinite hunger, but a flicker of confusion. This was it. The wrong note. I had to find the right one. My spinning finger stopped. The dial landed on a frequency I knew well, one I used to fall asleep to. It was a station that played old jazz and blues, the records often scratched, the sound warm and full of the hiss of time. The room filled with the sound of a lone, sad trumpet. It was a slow, mournful blues, a song of human loss and longing. It was the absolute antithesis of the entity's sterile, consuming hum. It was a song about having a soul, about feeling pain, about memory. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The darkness in the chair convulsed. The web-like patterns flared a brilliant, painful white, and then shattered like glass. A sound came from it. Not a hum, but a shriek of tearing fabric, a sound that belonged to no throat. The ancient eyes widened in something that might have been outrage, or perhaps a pain it had never known, the pain of being perceived as something other than what it was. The pull ceased. The heavy, dense feeling in the room evaporated. The chair gave a final, violent shudder. And then it was still. The darkness was gone. The eyes were once again just carved, polished wood. The humming had stopped. The only sound was the lonely trumpet from the radio, playing on into the quiet. I stood there, trembling, drenched in a cold sweat. The chair was just a chair again. But the memory of what it had been, what it had almost done, was seared into me. I looked out the window. The sirens had stopped. The city was dark, but the oppressive, hungry presence was gone. It had not been destroyed. It had been dismissed. Its signal interrupted. I walked to the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not touch it. I simply looked at the faded crimson velvet. It was just a chair, but I knew now that the world was full of such things. Quiet, patient objects waiting for the right song to wake them. And I, Dr. Bonnie Corrigan, was now a student of a new kind of epidemiology, one that tracked not viruses, but vibrations. I had learned the most important lesson of all. Some emptiness is not meant to be filled. It is meant to be silenced. I picked up the radio, the blues still playing, and turned up the volume. It was the only light I left. The silence that followed was more profound than any I had ever known. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of stillness. A fragile peace bought with a blues song. I did not sleep. I sat on the floor, my back against the desk, the radio cradled in my lap like a child. The station played on, a lone, defiant thread of sanity stretched across the void. As the hours wore on, the music was occasionally interrupted by bursts of panicked, half-understood transmissions. Words like cessation and unexplained remission filtered through. The thinned, it seemed, had simply stopped. They were found collapsed in the streets, in their homes, empty vessels with no guiding will, their connection severed. When the gray dawn finally bled through the grime on my windows, I forced myself to stand. My body ached with a weariness that went beyond the physical. I looked at the chair. It was inert, just wood and cloth. But the memory of its transformation was a brand on my mind. I could not leave it here. It was a dormant seed, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. I found an old wool blanket in a closet. The rough texture a comfort to my raw nerves. I did not let my skin touch the wood as I draped it over the chair, shrouding it from view. The act felt ritualistic, a necessary burial. Then, with a resolve that felt borrowed, I left my apartment. The city was a ghost of itself. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles. Windows were broken, but the terrible humming pressure was gone. The air no longer tasted of rust. People were emerging, their faces pale with shock and a dawning, fragile hope. They moved with the cautious steps of survivors in a world they no longer understood. I understood them perfectly. I made my way to the university library, a place Maria had loved. It was closed, its doors locked, but a side entrance yielded to a determined shove. The air inside was cool and smelled of paper and dust, a familiar academic scent that felt like a memory from another life. I went to the periodicals section, to the microfilm readers she had taught me to use. For days I lived there, fueled by a desperate need for context. I read local newspapers, city planning archives, personal diaries from the university's special collections. I was looking for a pattern, a story that matched the one I had lived. I found it in a series of articles from 1923. A charismatic spiritualist named Alistair Finch had held seances in this very city, claiming to channel a vast, silent intelligence from beyond the stars. His followers reported feelings of profound peace, of their worldly cares dissolving. Then, the attendees began to vanish. One by one, the investigations found nothing. The spiritualist and his entire circle were never seen again. The final article was a small, speculative piece about the auction of Finch's estate to settle his debts. The listed items included a set of dining chairs and one ornate reading chair, oak with velvet cushion. The chair had been here before. It had been waiting for a century. This was not a single battle won. It was a skirmish in a war I was only beginning to comprehend. The entity, the signal, whatever it was, did not die. It was patient. It would find another conduit, another quiet place to wait for a listener, for a consciousness tuned to its frequency of emptiness. I returned to my apartment as the sun set. The blanket still covered the chair. The radio was silent, its batteries dead. The ordinary sounds of a city struggling back to life filtered through the window. They were beautiful. I knew what I had to do. I could not destroy the chair. To try would be to engage with it, to observe it with violent intent, and risk tuning myself to its frequency once more. But I could hide it. I could lose it in a place so vast, so chaotic, so full of the wrong notes of human life that it might never be found. I would take it to the deep desert, to canyons that swallowed sound, or sink it in the crushing, lightless silence of the ocean deep. I would become a keeper of this terrible secret, a warden of silence. My life's work was no longer healing the sick. It was ensuring the world remained loud, messy, and beautifully, chaotically alive. I looked at the shrouded shape in the corner. It was just a chair, and I was just a woman. But I had changed the station once. I would spend the rest of my life making sure no one else had to. The logistics of moving it were a problem I had not fully considered. I could not call a moving company. I could not ask a friend. The thought of another person laying hands on it, of their unique consciousness brushing against its dormant potential, sent a fresh chill through me. In the end, I used the blanket as a sling, dragging the heavy, shrouded mass across the floor. The legs scraped grooves in the hardwood, a sound that set my teeth on edge. It felt less like moving furniture and more like transporting a coffin. I owned a beat-up station wagon, a relic from a more practical phase of my life. Getting the chair into the back was a trial of sweat and terror. Every shift in its weight felt intentional, a subtle testing of its bonds. When the tailgate finally closed, I leaned against the cold metal, my breath plumbing in the morning air. The city was still quiet, but the silence was different now. It was the quiet of exhaustion, not of predation. I did not know where I was going, only that it had to be far from here, from any place where a seeking mind might someday wander. I drove for hours, leaving the city sprawl behind, watching the landscape flatten and dry out through the bug-spattered windshield. The blanket-shrouded form was a dark presence in my rearview mirror, a blind spot I could always feel. I stopped at a dusty crossroads gas station, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. The air was hot and smelled of gasoline and baked earth. Inside, a radio behind the counter was playing tinny country music, a song about heartbreak and pickup trucks. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I bought bottled water and a map, spreading the latter out on the hood of my car. My finger traced a route deep into the desert, toward a region marked by vast, empty spaces and the stark warning: unforgiving terrain. The old man behind the counter watched me, his eyes pale and watery. "Ain't much out that way," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Just sand and rock and silence." "Silence is what I'm looking for," I said, and the truth of it felt heavy in my mouth. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already knew. "Folks out there, they say the land gets into your head. Makes you hear things that ain't there, or forget things that are." I folded the map carefully, my hands steady for the first time in days. I'll take my chances. The further I drove, the more the world simplified. The sky was a vast, bleached bowl overhead. The land was a tapestry of red rock, scrub, and endless, rolling dunes. I turned off the paved road, then off the graded dirt road, following tire tracks that grew fainter until they disappeared altogether. I drove until the station wagon could go no further, its tires sinking into the soft sand. I got out. The silence was absolute. It was a physical weight, a presence that pressed in on my eardrums. This was the kind of silence the thing in the chair would crave. A blank canvas. For a moment I doubted my plan. Was I delivering it to a perfect new home? Then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper of wind moving over the canyon walls. It was a dry, rustling sigh, a natural sound that held no melody, no intent. It was chaos. It was a raw note in the pure silence. It was perfect. I unpacked the chair, dragging it out into the open. The blanket caught on a thorny bush and pulled away, revealing the dark, patient wood. I did not look directly at the finials. I kept my gaze on the horizon, on the immense, indifferent beauty of the desert. Using a small camping shovel, I began to dig at the base of a massive sandstone cliff, in a place where the shadows were long and the air was cool. The work was slow, the ground hard-packed and stony. I did not bury it deep. I tipped the chair into the shallow depression and began pushing the sand and rocks back over it. I worked until it was just a mound, an unremarkable feature in a landscape full of unremarkable features. In a year, the wind would have scoured it clean or covered it deeper. It would become part of the desert, its specific shape lost to time. As I shoveled the last of the sand, my skin prickled. I felt a faint, familiar vibration through the soles of my boots. A hum, so low it was almost a feeling rather than a sound. It was the chair, sensing the profound quiet, stirring in its sleep. It was testing the air of its new prison. I turned and walked back to the car, not looking back. I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out the dead radio. I shook it. I rattled it. I pressed my ear against its plastic shell. Nothing. Nothing. Then, I slammed it hard against the side of the car. The casing cracked. I hit it again and again. On the third impact, a spark jumped in its guts and a burst of static, loud and violent, screeched into the desert air. The hum stopped. I threw the shattered radio toward the buried chair. It landed on the sand with a dull thud. Let it listen to that. Let it listen to the wind and the scuttling of lizards and the occasional, meaningless crackle of a broken machine. Let its song be drowned in a sea of wrong notes forever. I got in the car and drove away. I did not know if I had saved the world. I only knew I had contained a single, terrible question. And as I pointed the car toward the distant hum of the highway, toward the messy, noisy, beautiful world of people, I knew my work was just beginning. There would be other quiet places, other patient things, and I would be listening for them. The drive back was a blur of heat haze and trembling hands. I kept the windows down, letting the roar of the wind fill the car. A welcome assault on my senses. I needed the noise. When I finally reached the outskirts of the city, the familiar hum of generators and the distant wail of a siren were a symphony. They were the sounds of a world fighting to live, and I clung to them. My apartment felt alien. The silence there was no longer peaceful. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. The grooves in the floor from the chair's legs were like scars. I cleaned furiously, scrubbing every surface, not to remove dirt, but to erase the memory. It was futile. The knowledge was inside me now, a cold, hard stone in my gut. A week later, a knock came at my door. It was Alan. He stood in the hallway, thinner than I remembered, his eyes shadowed with the same haunted look I saw in my own mirror. He held a small, shielded case. "You're alive," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You too. We didn't hug. We just stood there, two survivors of a shipwreck no one else knew had happened." He stepped inside, his eyes immediately going to the empty space in the corner. He nodded slowly. I tracked a signal, or the lack of one. It just winked out, Then the reports started coming in. The thinned were just people again. Lost, traumatized, but people? He placed the case on my kitchen table and clicked it open. Inside, nestled in foam, was a device that looked like a sophisticated Geiger counter with a small, clear screen that showed a fluctuating waveform. I built this. It measures quantum decoherence, for lack of a better term. It listens for quiet. He switched it on. The device emitted a soft, steady ping. The waveform on the screen was a chaotic, jagged line. This is a city. This is baseline reality. Messy, unobserved, alive. He looked at me. "What did you do, Bonnie?" I told him. I told him about the radio, about the blues, about the shriek of tearing fabric. I told him about the desert. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "You collapsed the waveform," he whispered. "You didn't destroy the particle. You just forced it into a different state. A dormant one." He gestured to the device. "The chair is still a focal point. It's just muted. For now. It's not the only one, is it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head. "No, it can't be. The conditions that created it, they're not unique. They're rare. But they're not unique." He tapped the screen of the device. "This is our early warning system. There are others out there. Objects, places, maybe even people that are thin, that are waiting for the right song." He left the device with me. I didn't argue. It belonged with me as much as the memory of the chair did. Alan returned to what was left of the CDC to try and rebuild a public health system for a world that would never understand the true nature of its recent illness. My work took a different path. I resigned from the university. My research now had a new, singular focus. I moved to a small, loud apartment above a jazz club. The music that drifted up through the floorboards at all hours was my lullaby and my shield. The device on my desk, which I had named the Static, was my compass. I began to cross-reference Alan's data with my own historical research, looking for patterns. Unexplained mass disappearances in a Welsh mining town. The sudden, peaceful dissolution of a remote Japanese monastery. A fad for a particular type of ceramic doll in Vienna that preceded a wave of apathy and despair. Each event a potential node. Each a story of a signal being received. My life became a journey into the world's quiet corners, armed with the Static and a bag full of random noisemakers. A harmonica, a handful of rattles, a small, powerful speaker loaded with recordings of thunderstorms and city traffic. I was no longer Dr. Corrigan, epidemiologist. I was a tuner, a mechanic of reality. My job was not to fight the silence, but to ensure it was never perfect enough for the signal to get through. I was in a library in Reykjavik, tracking the lead about a peculiar runestone, when the Static's ping changed. The steady rhythm became a frantic, high-pitched whine. The waveform on the screen, once chaotically jagged, was smoothing out, resolving into a faint but unmistakable harmonic pattern. I looked up from the ancient text. The library was preternaturally quiet. The few other patrons had stopped turning pages. They were simply sitting, staring into the middle distance, their faces settling into a placid, empty calm. The silence was no longer empty. It was listening, and it was beginning to hum. I closed the book. The sound of the cover shutting was like a gunshot in the hush. The humming was not in the air, but in the marrow of my bones. A familiar, dreadful resonance. I reached into my bag, my fingers closing around the cold plastic of the speaker. The Static's whine was a needle in my ear. I didn't have a blues song this time. I had a recording of a Reykjavik fish market, the cacophony of shouts, seagulls, and slamming crates. I pressed play. The sound was jarring, alien, and beautiful. It was a wave of pure, undirected life crashing into the gathering silence. One of the reading patrons flinched, his head snapping up as if waking from a dream. The harmonic pattern on the static screen shattered back into chaotic noise. The hum in my bones receded, not gone, but thwarted. The focal point wasn't the runestone. It was the library itself, a temple of quiet order built over a geological fault line of stillness. I packed my things quickly, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was not a skirmish I could win here, not permanently. I was a temporary disruption, a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples would fade. The silence would return. My work was not here in the aftermath, but at the source. I had to find what was thinning this place, this specific library, and break its connection before the signal found a stronger vessel. The hunt was on, and the quiet was my quarry. I walked out into the crisp Icelandic air, the sounds of the city a welcome armor, and knew I was only just beginning to trace the edges of a vast and invisible war. The lead in library archives pointed me toward a private collection, the life's work of a reclusive folklorist named Magnus, who had died the previous winter. His niece, a pragmatic woman named Eva, had donated his papers to the library, but she had kept a few items for herself. She lived in a small, modern house on the outskirts of the city, all sharp angles and large windows, looking out at the brooding mountains. When I showed her the static and explained in a carefully edited version what I was looking for, her face grew pale. "There is one thing," she said, leading me to a study filled with books and the scent of old pipe tobacco. He was obsessed with it at the end. He called it the listening stone. She opened a glass-fronted cabinet. Inside, on a velvet stand, was a smooth, dark gray river stone, about the size of a fist. It was unremarkable, except for a single, perfectly straight fissure that ran across its surface, as if it had been neatly sliced by a laser. The static, which had been emitting a steady, anxious ping, suddenly flatlined. The screen went dark for a single heart-stopping second, then flashed back to life, the waveform a perfectly flat horizontal line. Pure, unadulterated silence. "It's a fossil," Eva said, her voice hushed. "Not of a creature, but of a sound. A pocket of absolute silence from the beginning of the world." Magnus believed it was a seed, that it was trying to grow. I understood then. The chair was a receiver, an antenna. This stone was something else. It was a source, a well of nothingness so profound it pulled reality thin around it, making a place ripe for the signal. The library, with its enforced quiet and intellectual order, was the perfect amplifier. I had to get it out of there. "I need to take it," I said, my voice tight. Eva looked from the stone to my face, and she must have seen the raw, unvarnished truth in my eyes. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, wrapped the stone in a thick woolen cloth, and placed it in my hands. The moment I touched it, a coldness seeped through the fabric, not a temperature, but an absence of energy. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the faint electrical buzz of the lights, they all seemed to recede, dampened by the stone's gravitational pull towards silence. I drove away from her house, the wrapped stone sitting on the passenger seat. The static had gone berserk, its screen a mess of conflicting data, unable to process the concentrated nullity so close to its sensors. I knew I couldn't bury this like the chair. Burying a source would only create a deeper, more potent center of silence. I had to drown it, not in noise, but in something even more fundamental. I drove toward the coast, to a place where the North Atlantic crashed against the black sand beaches. The wind was a roaring giant, whipping spray into my face. I climbed out onto a jagged promontory, the stone heavy in my hand. The waves below were chaos incarnate, a relentless pounding percussion of water against rock. It was the oldest song in the world. I held the stone out over the churning water. For a moment, I felt a pull, not from the stone, but from the peace it promised. A final end to the struggle, the fear, the constant vigilance, an easy silence. I closed my eyes, gripping the woolen cloth tighter. Then, with a shout that was torn away by the wind, I threw it. The stone arced out and down, swallowed instantly by the foam and the fury. The effect was immediate. It was as if a pressure valve had been released. The sound of the ocean seemed to swell, becoming richer, more layered. The static on my belt, which had been silent and dark, suddenly screamed to life, its waveform a glorious, jagged mess. The stone was gone, its perfect silence shattered by the eternal, chaotic symphony of the sea. It was not destroyed. It was lost in the one choir too vast and too ancient for its quiet to ever dominate. I stood there for a long time, letting the spray soak me, listening to the beautiful, deafening roar. One source was gone, but the war continued. I turned and walked back to the car, already thinking of the next quiet place and the next. Story 2. The first sound was not a sound at all, but a silence so profound it had its own texture, a thick velvet muffling the world. And into that silence, a single silver note insinuated itself. It was the sound of a clock, ticking, but not from any wall or mantelpiece I could find. It was a phantom heartbeat, a measured, metallic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house, a whisper of gears and levers from a forgotten room deep within the walls. I would lie in my bed in the west wing, the feather mattress swallowing me whole, and listen to it. Tick. A pause long enough to make me doubt I had heard it. Tock, tock. It was the only thing that seemed alive in Bly, the only thing that moved with purpose in the great, sleeping carcass of the estate. I had come to Bly in a burst of autumn gold, the trees along the drive afire against a hard blue sky. The interview in London had been a strange, clipped affair. The children's guardian, a man named John, handsome in a carved, distant way, had laid out the terms with an air of distracted finality. His nephew and niece, Miles and Flora, were perfect darlings, he assured me. A tragedy had taken their parents, and he, a bachelor with no aptitude for the country, required a governess of sound mind and good character to see to their education at the family seat. The salary was shockingly generous. "There is only one condition," he had said, his eyes not on me, but on the rain-streaked window of his club. "You must never, under any circumstances, trouble me. You are to handle everything." "Everything? Do you understand?" I had nodded, my young heart swelling with a sense of importance, of being chosen for a great and solitary responsibility. The house itself was a character in our little drama, a vast and beautiful invalid. Its stone facade was veined with ivy that rustled like dry parchment in the wind. Inside, the light fell in heavy, dusty shafts, illuminating floating motes that danced like tiny ghosts. The air smelled of beeswax, dried roses, and, underneath it all, the faint, damp odor of stone, the cold breath of a place that has been shut up for too long. Jill, the housekeeper, was a woman of few words, and a face that seemed to have been shaped by a lifetime of quiet endurance. She showed me to my room, her keys jangling a somber melody at her waist. "The children are in the garden," she said, her voice low and soft. "You'll find they are. Very bright. Very good." There was something in her tone, a hesitation so slight I almost missed it, that suggested being very good was a performance, and all performances must eventually end. And they were good. They were, in fact, preternaturally good. Miles, with his color starched and his eyes of ancient blue, was a little gentleman, quoting Latin and offering his arm with a formality that was both charming and unsettling. Flora was all golden curls and innocent smiles, her laughter like a string of tiny bells. They moved through the grand, echoing rooms of Bly with an eerie grace, their small lives the only animation and the still life perfection of the place. We fell into a routine of lessons and walks, of stories by the fire, and yet I always felt I was observing them from behind a pane of thick glass. Their perfection was a wall. I would catch them sometimes, standing perfectly still at a window, looking out at the lake or the topiary garden, their faces blank and waiting, as if listening for a cue only they could hear. The first crack in this pristine world appeared on a day of flat, gray light. We were by the lake, a slate-colored sheet of water fringed with reeds. Flora was weaving a crown of daisies, her small fingers nimble and sure. I was reading to them, but my attention was snagged by a figure on the far side of the water, a man standing among the distant willows. He was dressed in dark clothes, his posture rigid, his face a pale, featureless oval, turned directly toward us. A coldness, separate from the autumn air, touched the back of my neck. "Flora," I said, my voice unnaturally calm. "Who is that man?" She did not look up from her daisies. "There is no man, Miss Anna," she sang softly. I looked at Miles. He was skipping a stone across the water, his expression one of serene concentration. "Miles?" He turned his ancient blue eyes on me. "She is quite right. There's no one there at all." When I looked back, the figure was gone. The willows swayed, empty. That was the beginning of the seeing. The man by the lake became a recurring guest in my periphery. I would see him at the top of the grand staircase, a tall, dark shape receding around a corner. I would glimpse his pale face in a rain-streaked window, a reflection that should not have been there. And then there was the woman. I first saw her in the garden, a figure in black standing on the blunted teeth of the old battlements, her hair a wild dark cloud around her head, her gaze fixed on the house with a terrible hungry longing. She was there, and then she was not. A trick of the light, a wisp of fog, but I felt her. Her presence left a stain on the air, a feeling of such profound and focused malice that the birds would fall silent for minutes after she vanished. I confided in Jill, my words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate whisper in the humming quiet of her kitchen. She listened, her hands never still, kneading dough or polishing silver, her face a mask of practical concern. "The mind plays tricks in a big old house, miss," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Shadows get long. The wind sounds like voices. You're young and you're not used to the quiet." But her kindness felt like a dismissal. She was building a wall of rationality between me and what I knew, what I felt in the very marrow of my bones. The children, when I tentatively questioned them, were a united front of innocent denial. Their wide eyes and puzzled expressions were so convincing that I began, in my darkest moments, to wonder if Jill was right. Was the solitude unhinging me? Was the great, brooding silence of Bly driving a splinter into my sanity? The ticking, that phantom heartbeat, grew louder. It was no longer just at night. I heard it in the middle of a lesson, throbbing underneath Miles's recitation of French verbs. I heard it pacing my steps as I walked along portrait-lined hallways, the faces of Bly's dead ancestors staring down with indifferent eyes. The house began to speak in other ways. A faint, sweet smell of decay would waft from a locked room. I would feel a sudden, icy draft in a sunlit corridor. I started to dream of the woman in black, of her standing over the children's beds, her long, white fingers hovering just above their sleeping foreheads. The climax arrived on a day of howling wind, the eve of Miles' departure for school, a prospect he had accepted with a quiet, unnerving resignation. The house was a drum, the wind beating against its stones. I had put Flora to bed and was reading in the library, trying to quiet the frantic thrumming of my own heart, when I saw him. The man, He was not a glimpse or a suggestion. He was there, solid and real, standing in the far corner of the room near the globe. He was dressed in the clothes of a former century, his face handsome and utterly appallingly corrupt. It was a face that knew things, terrible things, and took a slow, sensual pleasure in that knowledge. His eyes, dark and liquid, held mine, and he smiled. A terror, pure and electric, shot through me. It was not the fear of a ghost, but the fear of a truth so vile it could curdle the soul. He was here for Miles. The thought was a certainty, an instinct deeper than reason. I flew from the room, my book tumbling to the floor, and ran up the stairs, my breath sobbing in my throat. I went not to my own room, but to Miles's. I pushed the door open softly. The room was bathed in the faint blue light of the moon, fighting its way through the storm clouds. And there she was, the woman in black. She was bent over Miles's bed, her form seeming to drink the light from the room. She was whispering to him, a sibilant, liquid stream of sound, and his eyes were open, staring up at her, not with fear, but with a kind of rapt, terrible recognition. "Get away from him!" I screamed, and the sound was raw, tearing my throat. The figure straightened with an unnatural, gliding motion. She turned her head, and I saw her face fully for the first time. It was not the face of a monster, but of a woman who had been beautiful once. Now, it was a landscape of grief and rage, her eyes hollow pits of need. She looked from me to Miles, and then she was simply gone, not vanishing, but ceasing to be. The air where she had stood now cold and empty. I rushed to Miles's side, gathering his small, stiff body in my arms. "What did she say to you? What did she want?" I cried. He looked at me, and the little gentleman was gone. In his place was someone older, someone weary and cruel. "She wants us to be with her," he said, his voice flat. "She wants us to be hers. She says we are hers already." He looked toward the door. "And he has come for me. Peter Quint has come. He says it's time." The name, spoken aloud, made the air in the room grow thick and heavy. I held him tighter, a fierce, possessive love roaring through my fear. "No, you are mine. I will protect you. I will not let them have you." I kept him with me that night, in my room. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair and sat vigil in a seat by the window, watching the storm rage. I did not sleep. I listened. The wind screamed, and underneath its fury, I heard the ticking, louder than ever, a frantic, metallic countdown. And then, another sound. A soft, sliding sound, like silk against the door. Then a whisper. A voice that was both a man's and a woman's, a dissonant chord of seduction and despair. "Miles," it whispered, "we are waiting. Come to the tower." I clutched the boy, who lay rigid and awake beside me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Don't listen," I whispered into his hair. "It is not real." But it was real. It was the only real thing in the world. The battle was not for his body, but for his soul, a tiny, flickering flame in that vast, dark house. As the first gray light of dawn stained the sky, the sounds faded. The house fell into a false, exhausted calm. I must have dozed, for the next thing I knew, a shaft of pale sun was on my face. The chair was still against the door. The room was still, but the space beside me in the bed was empty. Miles was gone. I found him on the old battlements, where I had first seen the woman. He was standing on the narrow, crumbling ledge, his small figure silhouetted against the sickly dawn. The wind tore at his nightshirt. Peter Quint was there, a solid, dark presence behind him, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder, not to pull him back, but to steady him for the step forward. And the woman, Miss Jessel, was there too, her face a mask of ecstatic triumph. "Miles!" I screamed, bursting onto the rooftop. He turned his head. Our eyes met. In his, I saw a final fleeting moment of the child he had been, a spark of terror and confusion. And then I saw the corruption, the ancient, knowing darkness, snuff it out. It was not the ghosts who had taken him. It was the house. It was the silence. It was the terrible, beautiful perfection that had hidden the rot within. "Look what you made me do," he said. And his voice was the ticking of the clock, the whisper in the walls, the voice of Bly itself. He did not jump. He simply let go. He stepped off the ledge into the air as if stepping into a waiting room. There was no cry, only the terrible soft sound of the wind, and then a silence more absolute than any I had ever known. They said it was a tragic accident. A sleepwalking boy, a careless governess. John came, a flurry of black coats and grim efficiency. He did not look at me. He arranged for Flora to be taken away to live with a relative in Scotland. Jill packed my bags with a face of stone. I was given a sum of money and put on a train, dismissed, erased. But Bly is not done with me. I live in a small room in a noisy city now, but the silence follows me. It is the silence of that house, and it lives inside my head. I hear the ticking, a constant, patient rhythm underneath the traffic, and the voices. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to the smell of dried roses and damp stone. I see them, sometimes, in the shifting patterns of rain on my window. The tall, dark man and the hungry woman. And between them, 2 golden children, their faces pale and serene. They are waiting. They are not ghosts. They are the true residents of that place, and they are patient. They know that houses like Bly are not just made of stone and mortar, but of memory and longing. They know that a story like ours does not end with a death or a departure. It simply finds a new, dark corner in which to wait, and it ticks on, and on, and on, forever. The money he gave me is still in a tin box under my bed. I cannot bring myself to spend it. It feels like payment for a sin, blood money that carries the chill of the house within its paper folds. My new life is a frantic pantomime of normalcy. I take a position as a companion to an old lady who is deaf and half blind. She dozes in her chair by the fire, and I sit opposite her, stitching, the needle moving in and out of the cloth, in a rhythm that is a poor, shallow imitation of that other, deeper ticking. The city outside my window is a constant roar, a cataract of life meant to drown out the past. But it does not. The silence of Bly is not an absence of sound. It is a presence. It is a creature that traveled with me, curled up in my chest where my heart used to be. It feeds on the noise, using it as a screen. In the lull between a carriage's rumble and a vendor's cry, I hear it. Tick, midroll. A pause. Talk. Dow. I see Flora in every little girl with golden curls. I see Miles in every serious-faced boy with neatly parted hair. Once, in the park, I saw a child who was his very image walking hand-in-hand with a severe-looking nanny. He turned and looked at me, and his eyes were not ancient blue, but a common, cheerful brown. The disappointment was a physical pain, a nausea that bent me double on the path. I had not realized, until that moment, that a part of me was still hoping to find them, to see them again, to somehow undo what was done. The old lady I care for, Mrs. Gross, has a name that is a constant, low-grade torment. It is not her fault, of course. She is kind in her vague, distant way. But the name is a key that turns a lock in my mind, and I am back in that kitchen, with my Jill, her face averted, her hands busy with practicalities, building her wall of lies. Or were they lies? I no longer know. Perhaps she truly believed it was shadows in the wind. Perhaps that was the only way she could live in that house, by becoming a part of its quiet conspiracy. I write letters to the relative in Scotland, a Mrs. Hammond, who took Flora. I write them over and over in my head, sometimes scribbling frantic drafts on stolen pieces of paper. I beg for news. I ask after the child's health, her spirits, her dreams. Does she ever speak of me? Does she ever mention a man, or a woman, or a tower? I never send the letters. The address I have is likely false, and even if it is not, what right do I have? I am the careless governess, the one who failed. The true horror, I have come to understand, was not the ghosts. Peter Quint and Miss Jessel were merely symptoms, the fever that breaks through the skin to show the infection within. The horror was the house itself, its beautiful, suffocating perfection. A gilded cage where two vibrant children were being curated, their spirits slowly replaced with the cold, collected air of the past. They were being taught to be still, to be quiet, to be waiting. For what? For an inheritance of sorrow? For a membership into a society of the elegantly damned? My failure was not that I saw the ghosts, but that I did not understand soon enough that the children were already lost. They were not being haunted. They were being recruited. Miles' final words were not the taunt of a possessed boy, but the cold, logical conclusion of his education at Bly. Look what you made me do. I had made him see the conflict. I had introduced a note of love, of messy, human concern, into their sterile world. And that disruption, that flicker of true life, had broken him. Tonight, the ticking is very loud. It is not in my head. It is in the room. It is coming from the tin box under my bed. I kneel on the rough floorboards and pull it out. The cold metal seeps into my hands. I lift the lid. The money lies there, neat and crisp, and underneath it, wrapped in a piece of black silk I do not recognize, is a small, tarnished silver locket. I never owned a locket. My fingers are numb as I pry it open. Inside there is no picture. There is only a tiny, intricate mechanism, a set of miniature gears, turning, turning, turning. It is the source of the sound. Tick. Talk it out. I do not throw it out the window. I do not scream. I simply close the locket and hold it in my palm, feeling its metallic pulse travel up my arm. They have found me, or perhaps they never let me go. This small, ticking heart is the true leash. Bly has extended its roots, its stones, its silence into this noisy city, into this small room. They are waiting for me to understand that there is no escape, only a change of address. The story is not over. It is simply my turn to listen. The locket grew warm in my hand, its ticking a steady, intimate rhythm against my skin. It was not a threat, but a reminder, a summons. Mrs. Gross snored softly in her chair, oblivious to the shift in the world. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the teeming street. The people were like ants, scurrying through their lives, deaf to the silences that live between the sounds. I was no longer one of them. I was a citizen of Bly. I knew what I had to do. The money in the tin box was not a payment for my silence, but a fare for my return. The thought filled me not with dread, but with a cold, clear purpose. The long, numb months of exile were over. I had been waiting just as they had, though I had not known it. I gave Mrs. Gross a week's notice, inventing a sick relative in the country. She nodded, her milky eyes showing no suspicion, only a mild annoyance at the inconvenience. I packed my single bag, leaving behind the city clothes that felt like a costume. I kept the locket. I wore it under my dress, its pulse a secret conversation against my chest. On the train north, the urban roar faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks. a sound that slowly, inexorably, began to sync with the ticking from the lock. The landscape outside changed, greening and emptying, the sky widening into a vast, pale expanse I remembered too well. I did not take a carriage from the village. I walked the final miles, the bag growing heavy in my hand. The sky was the same flat gray as the day I first saw the man by the lake. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. And then I saw it, through a break in the trees. The cluster of towers and chimneys. The dark windows like sightless eyes. Bly. It looked smaller, shabbier, but its presence was undiminished. It was not a ruin. It was a sleeping beast. The gate was rusted but unlocked. It swung open with a groan that was the first human sound I had heard from the place in a year. The drive was overgrown with weeds, cracking the gravel. No smoke rose from the chimneys. John had closed the house, unable to sell it, unwilling to live in it. It was alone, waiting. The great oak door was locked. I had expected this, but I remembered a side entrance, a servant's door near the old kitchen garden, that had a warped frame and a latch that never quite caught. I walked around the side of the house, my feet crunching on the gravel, the sound absurdly loud in the silence. The garden was a wilderness, the topiary animals now shapeless, monstrous blobs. The door was there. I pushed, and it gave with a splintering protest. The air inside was cold and still, thick with the smell of dust and sealed-up rooms. It was not the sweet decay I remembered, but something drier, more final. I stood in the hallway, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The furniture was shrouded in white sheets, giving the grand rooms the appearance of a gallery of ghosts. My own ghost walked here, a younger, more terrified version of myself, rushing up the stairs, her heart pounding with a fear that was still fresh. I made my way to the main staircase. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, but underneath them, I could hear it. The ticking was here too. It was not just in the locket anymore. It was in the walls, in the very foundations. The house was a giant clock, and I had stepped back inside its mechanism. I climbed the stairs, not to the nursery, not to my old room, but to the battlements. The door to the roof was heavy, iron-banded. I put my shoulder to it, and it scraped open, letting in a gust of wind that stirred the dust motes into a frantic dance. The view was the same. The lake, the trees, the endless gray sky. The wind whipped at my hair and clothes. I walked to the ledge where Miles had stood. The stone was cold and rough under my fingers. I looked down at the ground far below, where his small body had fallen. There were no flowers, no marker. The earth had simply taken him back. I felt a presence beside me. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a certainty. I did not turn. I kept my eyes on the horizon. "I am here," I said, my voice quiet, absorbed by the wind. The king in the locket intensified, a rapid, approving rhythm. I understood now. My role was not to save them. It was to witness, to continue the story. The children were gone, but the house remained, and it required a keeper for its silence, a guardian for its terrible truths. I was not their governess anymore. I was their successor. I would live in the quiet. I would listen to the ticks and the talks, and I would wait. For what? I did not know. But the waiting itself was the point. It was the purpose Bly had always intended for me. And in that waiting, in the heart of the silence, I finally felt a sense of peace. Dark and deep and absolute. The wind did not lessen, but its sound changed. The howl became a murmur, and the murmur resolved itself into a voice I knew. It was Miles, but not as he was at the end. It was his voice from the beginning. Clear and bright and impossibly close. "You came back," he said. I turned. He was there, standing a few feet from me on the battlements. He was not a ghost. He was solid, real. His cheeks flushed with the cold, his hair tousled by the wind. He was the little gentleman, perfect and whole. Behind him, the door to the roof was gone. There was only the stone wall of the tower, ancient and seamless. "Miles," I whispered, my heart a wild, trapped bird in my chest. "We knew you would," he said, and he smiled. It was his old, charming smile, but it did not reach his eyes, which were the same ancient, knowing blue I had seen at the last. "The house is so much better with you in it. It was lonely after Flora left." "Is she here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Not yet," he said, taking a step closer. "But she will be. She misses us. She just doesn't know it yet." He held out his hand. It was not a request, but a command. I looked from his face to his outstretched hand, then down at the locket I still clutched in my own. It was no longer tarnished, but shining, as if new. Its ticking had slowed, becoming the calm, steady heartbeat of the house itself. This was the choice. I could turn from him, fight my way back through the non-existent door, and return to the world of the deaf and the blind, a world that had already forgotten me. Or I could take his hand and step fully into the story, into the silence I'd carried with me all along. I thought of Flora's laughter in the garden. I thought of Miles reading by the fire. I thought of the terrible, beautiful stillness that had claimed them. They were not lost. They were preserved. And they wanted me to join them. I let the locket fall. It did not clatter on the stone, but was swallowed by the silence. Then I reached out and placed my hand in his. His fingers were warm and solid. He smiled again. And this time, it was a real smile. A child's smile, full of delight. "Come on," he said, tugging me gently. "Miss Jessel has made tea." He led me toward the wall. I did not hesitate. I walked with him, and the stones parted for us like a curtain, not opening into a dark tower, but into the bright, sunlit morning room of Bly, exactly as it had been. The fire crackled in the hearth. The air smelled of beeswax and roses. And seated on the sofa, pouring tea from a silver pot, was Miss Jessel. She looked up as we entered, and her face was no longer a mask of grief, but serene, beautiful, and utterly at peace. She nodded to me, a silent welcome. Miles led me to a chair. I sat, and he took his place beside Miss Jessel. I looked out to the tall window. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. The lake was still. Topiary animals were perfectly shaped lions and peacocks once more. There was no decay, no dust, no sound but the gentle crackle of the fire and the distant, happy call of a bird. This was the true Bly. This was the heart of the silence. It was not a place of horror, but of order. A perfect, endless afternoon where nothing changed and nothing was ever truly lost. I accepted a cup of tea from Miss Jessel. It was hot and sweet. I took a sip, and as I did, I felt the last of my fear, the last of my resistance drain away. I was home, and outside, in the world I had left, the house stood empty and crumbling, waiting for the next person who could not escape the silence, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The tea was not warm. It was the memory of warmth, a perfect echo of the sensation. I drank it, and it satisfied a thirst I had not known I possessed. Miss Jessel did not speak, but her silence was a conversation. Told me of peace, of an end to striving, of the sublime relief of no longer having to be a person in a world of people. Miles leaned against her, his eyes half closed, a small, contented smile on his lips. He was, finally, at rest. We sat that way for a long time, or perhaps no time at all. The light in the room did not change. The fire did not dim. It was a moment captured in amber, beautiful and eternal. I felt my own memories beginning to soften at the edges, the sharp pain of my former life, blurring into a series of gentle, faded pictures. The noisy city, Mrs. Gross's room, the frantic letters I never sent. They were all becoming someone else's story. Then, Miles lifted his head. "He's here," he said, his voice calm. The air in the room thickened. Miss Jessel's serene expression did not alter, but she straightened her spine almost imperceptibly. I followed their gaze to the doorway. Peter Quint stood there, leaning against the frame. He was not the threatening figure from the tower or the lake. He was as polished and handsome as I remembered, but the corruption in him was no longer a seething thing. It was a finished state, a fact of his existence, like the color of his eyes. He looked at me, and his smile was one of possession, not of welcome. "So you've joined the party," he said. His voice was the same low, insinuating drawl, but now it was part of the room's fabric, like the ticking of a clock. "Took you long enough." He walked in and took the seat opposite me, sprawling with an easy, familiar arrogance. He did not look at Miss Jessel or Miles. His attention was entirely on me. "We've been waiting. The house doesn't feel quite right without a governess. It upsets the balance." "I am not your governess," I said, and my own voice sounded distant to me, a relic. "Aren't you?" He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "What else is there to do here? We keep the hours. We walk the halls. We remember. And we wait for the others." "Others? The ones who hear the silence," Miles said softly. "Like you did." Quint leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "The world is full of people who can't stand the noise, my dear. They'll find their way here eventually. Or a piece of here will find its way to them. A locket, a song, a reflection in a window. You'll see." He stood and offered me his hand. I looked at Miss Jessel. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I looked at Miles, who watched me with his old, unnerving composure. I knew then that this was the next step. My education was not over. It was beginning. I placed my hand in Quint's. His grip was firm, his skin cool. He led me from the morning room, not back to the battlements, but into the main hall. It was no longer shrouded in dust sheets. It was gleaming, vibrant, alive with the same perfect, unchanging light. The portraits on the walls were no longer of strangers. I saw Miles and Flora in one, their faces set in serene, formal poses. In another, I saw Miss Jessel, beautiful and tragic. And in a newer, empty frame, I saw only a dark, reflective surface. "That one's for you," Quint said, following my gaze. "When you're ready." He led me up the grand staircase. Our footsteps made no sound. We passed the schoolroom, and I heard the faint, ghostly sound of Flora's laughter. We passed my old bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and I saw the bed neatly made, as if waiting. We did not stop until we reached the nursery window, the very one from which I had first seen him all that time ago. "This is where you watch," he said, his voice a whisper in my ear. "This is your post now." I looked out the window. The view was not of the grounds as they were, but as they are in the memory of the house. The light was golden, perpetual late afternoon. On the lawn I saw two children running. Flora, her golden curls bouncing, and Miles chasing her. They were not the pale, collected children of the drawing room. They were vibrant, laughing, alive with the energy I remembered from my first days. They were a perfect memory, playing on a loop for all eternity. "They are happy here," I said, and it was not a question. "They are what we remember them to be," Quint corrected. "And we are what they remember. It's a tidy arrangement." He left me there at the window. I stood and watched the children play. I watched the light that never faded. I listened to the silence that was not empty, but full. I had come back to Bly to end the story, but I had only stepped into its forever. I was no longer the governess. I was the memory of the governess. I was a new piece of the silence, a new figure in the pattern, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrible and comforting, that I would be standing here, watching, waiting, when the next lost soul heard the ticking and found their way home. The days began to blend, not into one another, but into a single, sustained moment. I kept my watch at the nursery window. Sometimes Miles and Flora would wave up at me, their smiles fixed in that golden light. And I would wave back, a silent participant in their endless game. Other times, the lawn would be empty, and I would simply watch the light on the grass, a light that never moved. Miss Jessel joined me sometimes. We did not speak, but we shared the silence. She would stand beside me, her gaze fixed on some point in the distance, perhaps watching for a memory of her own. Her presence was no longer frightening. It was familiar, like the weight of a well-worn shawl. Quint was less constant. He would appear suddenly in a doorway or at the end of a hall, always watching me, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. He was the current that ran through the stillness, a reminder of the dark energy that underpinned this perfect peace. One day, or one eternal moment, I was in the library. The books were all in their places, their leather spines pristine. I pulled a volume from the shelf at random. It was a book of fairy tales. I opened it, and the pages were blank. I tried another, a history, also blank. Every book in the library was empty. They were props, part of the stage setting. The only stories here were the ones we were living, the ones we were remembering. I heard a small, polite cough behind me. Miles was there, his hands clasped behind his back. "You cannot read them," he said, his tone that of a kind instructor. "There is nothing new to learn. The story is already written." "Then what is the point?" I asked, and the question felt both profound and foolish. "The point is the story itself," he said. "Its preservation. Its perfection. We are keeping it safe from change, from interpretation, from end." He walked over to the chessboard, set up in its usual place near the fire. The pieces were carved of ivory and jet. "Would you like to play? It is the only game we have. The moves are always the same." I sat opposite him. He moved a pawn. I moved another. We played, and I realized I knew every move he would make before he made it. I knew the exact moment I would lose. It was a memory of a game, played out again. When he said, "Checkmate," his voice held no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction at the completion of a pattern. Afterward, I returned to my post at the nursery window. The scene below had changed. The children were gone. A man was walking up the drive, his figure small and distant. He carried a suitcase. My breath caught. It was a new memory, one I did not own. I recognized the set of his shoulders, the hesitant walk. It was the master, the children's uncle. He was coming to Bly, as he had only once before, after the first governess died. He was coming to see me. I felt a presence at my shoulder. Quint was there, his breath cold near my ear. "This is a good one," he murmured. His confusion, his guilt, his desperate wish to have never come. We play this one often. I watched as the figure of the man drew closer, his face becoming clearer, etched with a reluctance that was a kind of agony. He was not a ghost, not a memory given solid form like Miles. He was a phantom, a recording on the air. He could not see me. He was trapped in his own moment of arrival, a moment we could observe and relive. "Is he suffering?" I asked, my voice hollow. "He is feeling what he felt," Quint corrected. "There is a difference. Suffering implies change. This is simply a state of being. It is part of the collection. The uncle reached the front door and hesitated, looking up at the house with dread. I knew what he was seeing, what he was feeling. I had seen that same look on my own face in the mirror of the city, a lifetime ago. I had pitied him then. Now I felt nothing but a distant academic interest. His struggle was a component of the machine, a gear that turned in predictable, necessary ways. I turned from the window. I had seen enough. Quint was smiling at me, a true, genuine smile of approval. "You see it now, don't you?" he said. "The beauty of it. The order." I nodded. I did see. The horror was not in the silence, nor in the loss. The horror had been in the struggle against it. Now that I had ceased to struggle, I was free. I was part of the order. I was a keeper of the silence, a curator of the pain of others. It was my purpose. And as I walked the silent, sun-drenched halls of Bly, I knew I would never leave again. For I was no longer a prisoner. I was the house itself. Story 3. It began not as a pain, but as a rhythm, a second pulse beating a frantic, syncopated counterpoint to the steady thrum in my own wrist. I first felt it in the car, my fingers resting on the sun-warmed vinyl of the dashboard, as the desert unspooled around us, a bleached and endless scroll. Thump, 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 dun, dun, thump, dun, 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 dun. It was a tiny, frantic drumbeat against the cage of my ribs, a thing with its own will, a secret tenant setting up house in the dark of my body. I said nothing to Luis, who was driving, his knuckles white on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the shimmering asphalt that promised a future we never seemed to reach. I just pressed my palm flat against my sternum, feeling the double-time percussion, a disobedient vibration that felt less like an ailment and more like a premonition. The town announced itself with a sigh of wind and a single sun-bleached sign that read Silverwell, Pop Dot Dotto, 87. The 87 felt like a historical artifact, a number from a census taken 50 years ago. The place was a collection of low, sand-blasted buildings, huddled against the encroaching dunes, their windows blind eyes coated with a fine, pale dust. The only thing that moved was a whirlwind of tumbleweed, dancing a skeletal jig down the main street. Luis pulled our tired station wagon into the gravel lot of a place called the Last Stop Diner. The engine ticked like a dying insect as we sat there, the silence of the town pressing in, a physical weight against the car windows. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old grease and weak coffee. A ceiling fan turned with a slow, lazy click, stirring the heat but not dispelling it. We were the only customers. A waitress with hair the color of straw and a face lined like a road map of this desolation poured our water without a word. Her eyes slid over us, through us, as if we were already ghosts. That was when I saw the child, a girl of maybe 9 or 10, sitting alone in a corner booth. She was drawing on a paper placemat with a stub of a crayon. Her name, I would learn, was Desiree. She looked up as we entered, and her gaze was not that of a child. It was ancient, liquid, and deeply knowing. It fixed on me, and for a fleeting second the frantic pulse in my chest stuttered, as if startled into a momentary calm. The trouble started with the car. It wouldn't turn over. Just a dry, grinding cough from the engine. Luis, ever the pragmatist, popped the hood and stared into the mechanical guts, as if his will alone could command them to life. I stood beside him, the heat rising from the pavement in visible waves, and that's when I first saw him. He emerged from the shimmering haze at the end of the street, a tall man in a faded sheriff's uniform. His walk was wrong. It wasn't a saunter or a stride. It was a glide, an unnervingly smooth progression that seemed to consume the distance without effort. His shadow, stretched long and thin by the waning sun, did not quite match his movements, lagging a half second behind as if reluctant to follow. He introduced himself as Sheriff Calder. His voice was a dry rustle like sand sliding over rock. His handshake was cool and firm, his skin like old parchment. His eyes were the color of the desert sky just before the stars emerge, a vacant, polished blue. They held no light, no curiosity, only a flat, assessing stillness. He promised us a mechanic, a place to stay for the night. His hospitality was a spider's web, politely spun. We had no choice. We were caught. He took us to what he called the guest house, a small, dusty bungalow on the edge of town that smelled of dust and sorrow. The windows were locked shut, painted over from the outside. There were others there already. A pair of bickering salesmen, their suits rumpled, their confidence shattered. A young couple, their hands perpetually clasped, their faces pale with a fear they could not name. We were a collection of lost things gathered in a single room. That first night, the wind began to howl. It was not a natural sound. It was a low, guttural moan that seemed to shape itself into words just at the edge of hearing. It spoke of dry bones and deep, cold places under the earth. And beneath it all, under the floorboards, I felt it. A vibration. A slow, colossal heartbeat that was not my own. A rhythm so vast it made the pulse in my chest seem like a feeble echo. The town was not empty. It was occupied, and the occupant was sleeping. Days bled into one another. A slow, sun-bleached nightmare. The sheriff was our warden. He brought us food, tasteless cans of beans and peaches, and water that carried the faint, metallic tang of the deep earth. He would stand in the doorway, his form blocking the light, and he would ask us questions. Not about who we were, but about what we believed. Did we believe in God? In souls? In sin? His voice was hypnotic, a soft drill probing for weaknesses. One of the salesmen, a man named Harris, tried to rush him on the third day. Calder didn't move. He simply looked at Harris, and the man stopped as if he'd hit a glass wall. A thin trickle of blood emerged from Harris' nose, then his ears, then his eyes. He crumpled to the floor, his body convulsing in silence. Calder stepped over him and left. We dragged the body into the small, barren backyard, a place of hard-packed dirt and thorny weeds. The earth was too hard to dig a proper grave. It was Desiree who showed me the truth. She would slip into our bungalow sometimes, moving with a quiet grace, her eyes old and sad. She never spoke, but she communicated through her drawings. She would sit beside me on the dusty floor, the frantic bird beat in my chest calming in her presence, and she would draw. She drew the town not as it was, but as it had been. She drew the people, their faces twisted in a final, silent scream as they walked one by one into the old silver mine on the hill. She drew the thing in the mine, a formless, shifting darkness with a single cyclopean heart of cold fire. And she drew the sheriff, a mere puppet, his limbs connected to the mine by glowing umbilical threads of shadow. The malevolence was not him. He was just the hand, the voice. The heart of the horror was deeper, older, hungrier. Luis, the writer, the observer, became something else. The fear forged him into a leader. He saw the patterns where the rest of us saw only chaos. He listened to the wind, studied Desiree's drawings, and watched the sheriff's comings and goings. He called the entity the Absence. It wasn't a demon or a ghost, he whispered to me one night, his voice raw in the dark. It was a void, a cosmic emptiness that fed on belief, on spirit, on the very noise of life. It had slept for eons beneath this silent place, and the faith of the miners, their hopes and prayers for silver, had been a ringing dinner bell. It had consumed the town, and now it fed on the scraps that wandered in. Us. And it was using Calder, a man of earthly authority, to break our will, to make our faith accessible. to tenderize our souls before the main course. The revelation came on a night when the wind's moan became a clear, intelligible voice. It spoke my name. It knew the rhythm of the secret pulse in my chest, and it called to it, a lover calling to its mate. I fell to my knees, clutching my torso, feeling the two rhythms, the small, frantic one inside me, and the vast, slow one below, trying to synchronize. Lewis held me, his own body trembling. "It's in you too," he breathed, his eyes wide with a terrible understanding. "It's a seed. It's planting itself in all of us, but you're fertile ground." The pulse was not a symptom. It was an infestation. A connection. The climax was not a battle of fists or guns. It was a war of quiet things. Calder came for us at dawn. He stood outside the bungalow, and this time, he did not speak. He simply raised a hand, and the walls began to vibrate. The dust rose in plumes, and the very air grew thin, sucked away by the immense vacuum of his will. The young couple began to weep, their faith dissolving into pure terror. A fine meal for the thing below. Lewis stood up. He had nothing but a small silver crucifix his grandmother had given him. A thing he wore as a sentimental piece, not an article of faith. He held it out, not at Calder, but past him, toward the mine. "I believe," Louis said, his voice a fragile thread against the roaring silence. "I believe in the light that casts a shadow. I believe in the word that creates a silence. I believe in us." It was not a prayer to a Christian God, but a declaration of existence against the absence. It was an act of pure, defiant faith. And it worked. For a moment, Calder flinched. The threads of shadow connecting him to the mine flickered. The entity recoiled from the simple, stubborn noise of Louis's belief. But faith is a flickering candle. The salesman had none. Their terror was a banquet. Calder's gaze shifted to them, and they simply unraveled. Their forms dissolved into a screaming mist that was drawn out the door, across the desert, and into the waiting darkness of the mine. The sacrifice was made. The entity was sated, for now. The pressure lifted. Calder lowered his hand, turned, and glided away. The wind died. We were left, Louise, myself, and the silent child, Desiree, standing in the ruins of our own souls. We did not try to fix the car. We knew it was pointless. The town was its gullet, and we were in its belly. Louis spends his days now writing our story on the walls of the bungalow with a piece of charcoal. A testament that will never be read. Desiree sits with me, her small hand often resting on my chest, a gentle dam holding back the tide. Her touch soothes the frantic pulse, but it cannot extinguish it, for I feel it growing stronger, day by day. The rhythm is becoming my rhythm. The will behind it is becoming my will. Louis looks at me sometimes, and I see the love in his eyes being slowly replaced by a dreadful recognition. He is starting to see the vacancy in my gaze, the same polished blue stillness I once saw in Calder's. It began not as a pain, but as a rhythm, a second pulse beating a frantic, syncopated counterpoint to the steady thrum in my own wrist. I feel it now, sitting here on the porch of the bungalow, watching the sun set over the desolate street. Thump, 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 thump. It is a tiny, frantic drumbeat, and it is learning the shape of my bones, the map of my veins. Soon, it will not need the sheriff anymore. Soon, it will have me. And I find, with a cold and settling peace, that I am no longer afraid. I am getting hungry. I look down the empty street, toward the shimmering haze, and I wait for the next set of headlights to appear. The silence in the bungalow was a different thing now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator waiting. but the thin, brittle silence of a place where all the sound had been consumed. Louis had stopped writing on the walls. The charcoal had worn down to a nub and then to nothing, and he simply sat in the corner, his knees drawn up to his chest, watching me. His eyes were hollows where hope had once lived. I could feel his gaze like a physical touch, a last frayed tether to the person I used to be. Desiree was my only comfort. She understood the change happening within me better than I did. She no longer brought her drawings. Instead, she would sit beside me on the porch steps, her small, warm body leaning against my side, which was growing perpetually cooler. Her hand on my chest was an anchor, a tiny point of heat and life that held the frantic pulse at bay for a few precious hours each day. But when she was gone, the rhythm would return, stronger and more insistent, a constant companion whispering promises of power and peace in a language only my bones could understand. Last night, I woke to the sound of Louis weeping. It was a raw, ugly sound, torn from a place of utter defeat. I lay on the thin mattress beside him, listening, and felt nothing. The pulse in my chest was a steady, comforting drum, and his grief was just a distant, irrelevant noise. I reached out a hand to touch his shoulder, a gesture that should have been one of comfort. But my fingers were cold, and he flinched away from my touch as if burned. He saw it then, what I'd been trying to hide even from myself. The vacancy was complete. This morning, Sheriff Calder did not bring our rations. He simply stood at the edge of the gravel lot, his hat casting a sharp shadow across his featureless face. He did not look at Louise or the bungalow. He looked only at me, and he nodded. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a passing of the torch. The threads of shadow that connected him to the mine were faint now, gossamer thin. The energy was flowing into me, the new vessel, the fresh conduit. The hunger is a low, pleasant thrum in my belly, a counterpart to the pulse in my chest. It is not a hunger for food. It is a craving for the crackle of a conscious mind, for the warmth of a fervent prayer, for the sweet, sharp tang of fear. I find myself listening. Not with my ears, but with something deeper, for the hum of an approaching engine, for the disruption in the silence that means new sustenance has arrived. Louis is standing in the doorway now. He has a small knife from the kitchen, the one we used to open the tasteless cans. His hand is shaken. "Fight it," he whispers, his voice cracking. "Please, remember who you are." I turn my head and look at him. I see the love and the terror warring in his eyes, and for a single fleeting second the pulse stutters. A memory surfaces, a ghost of a feeling. The sun on the dashboard, his hand on my knee, the open road ahead. It is a small, bright thing, and it hurts. But the rhythm is stronger. It smooths the memory away, folding it into the great, silent archive of all that has been consumed. I look at Luis, at the desperate, beautiful noise of him, and I feel only a deep, profound hunger. I smile. It is not my smile. It is Calder's smile. It is the smile of the absence. He takes a step back, the knife falling from his hand to clatter on the wooden floor. He knows. The last flicker of his faith dies in his eyes, extinguished not by the sheriff, but by me. I stand up. The movement is fluid, effortless, a glide. I walk past him, out onto the porch. The desert air is still. I can feel the immense, sleeping heart of the thing in the mine, and my own small pulse answers it, beat for beat. We are one. I look down the long, empty road past the blind windows of the town, and I wait. I am patient. I am hungry. And I am home. The first sign was a dust cloud on the horizon, a faint brown smudge against the bleached blue sky. Louis saw it too. He made a sound, a choked gasp that was part hope and part despair. He stumbled off the porch and began to run, not toward the road, but away from it, toward the barren expanse of desert behind the bungalow. It was a futile, instinctual flight. I watched him go, his figure growing smaller and more frantic, a dying animal sensing the end. I did not move. The pulse in my chest was a calm, steady metronome. The hunger was a quiet anticipation. The dust cloud resolved into a beat-up pickup truck, its paint oxidized to the color of the earth. It rattled to a stop in front of the last stop diner. A man and a woman got out, stretching their limbs. They were young, their faces open and unafraid. I could feel the life radiating from them, a vibrant, chaotic energy that made the air around me hum. The woman laughed at something the man said, and the sound was like a shard of glass in the silence, beautiful and sharp. I glided down the porch steps, my feet making no sound on the gravel. I did not walk toward them. I simply appeared at the edge of the diner's lot, as Calder used to do. They saw me and paused, their smiles faltering. The man offered a cautious wave. "Car trouble," he called out, his voice too loud for the quiet town. I did not answer. I let them look at me. I let them see the stillness, the polished blue of my eyes. The woman took a small step back, her hand finding the man's arm. The first tendril of their fear, thin and sweet, reached me. It was exquisite. Louis was a distant speck now, collapsing to his knees in the hard-packed dirt. His despair was a different flavor, bitter and familiar. A last meal already digested. The young man tried again, his voice less sure. "Is there a mechanic? Anyone around?" I finally moved, stepping forward. The shadows of the afternoon seemed to stretch and cling to me. "There is no mechanic," I said, and my voice was the rustle of sand, the creak of a deep earth settling. "But there is a place to stay." I gestured toward the bungalow. Their eyes followed my hand, and they saw the desperate figure of Louis far out in the desert, and they saw the absolute emptiness of the town. Their belief in a world where help existed, and strangers were benign, began to crumble. I fed on it, felt the pulse in my chest grow stronger, more resonant. The entity in the mind stirred, not with the sluggishness of sleep, but with the alertness of a creature presented with a feast. It was pleased. The threads of shadow that now connected me to the mountain were thick and strong, pulsing with a dark, shared life. The young couple did not protest as I led them away from their truck. They walked, mesmerized by the silence and the stillness and the awful certainty growing in their hearts. The door of the bungalow closed behind them with a soft final click. Inside, the silence was waiting. I turned and looked out once more at the desert, at the small, broken shape of Louis. He was part of the landscape now, another dry, forgotten thing. The wind picked up, but it no longer spoke of bones and cold places. It was my breath now, moving over the town, waiting for the next disruption, the next morsel of noise to consume. The rhythm was everything. The hunger was a constant, gentle companion. I was the warden, the hand, the voice. I was Silverwell. The silence in the bungalow was a different thing now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator waiting, but the thin, brittle silence of a place where all the sound had been consumed. Louis had stopped writing on the walls. The charcoal had worn down to a nub and then to nothing, and he simply sat in the corner, his knees drawn up to his chest, watching me. His eyes were hollows where hope had once lived. I could feel his gaze like a physical touch, a last, frayed tether to the person I used to be. Desiree was my only comfort. She understood the change happening within me better than I did. She no longer brought her drawings. Instead, she would sit beside me on the porch steps, her small, warm body leaning against my side, which was growing perpetually cooler. Her hand on my chest was an anchor, a tiny point of heat and life that held the frantic pulse at bay for a few precious hours each day. But when she was gone, the rhythm would return, stronger and more insistent, a constant companion whispering promises of power and peace in a language only my bones could understand. Last night, I woke to the sound of Louis weeping. It was a raw, ugly sound, torn from a place of utter defeat. I lay on the thin mattress beside him, listening, and felt nothing. The pulse in my chest was a steady, comforting drum, and his grief was just a distant, irrelevant noise. I reached out a hand to touch his shoulder, a gesture that should have been one of comfort, but my fingers were cold, and he flinched away from my touch as if burned. He saw it then, what I had been trying to hide even from myself. The vacancy was complete. This morning, Sheriff Calder did not bring our rations. He simply stood at the edge of the gravel lot, his hat casting a sharp shadow across his featureless face. He did not look at Louise or the bungalow. He looked only at me, and he nodded. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a passing of the torch. The threads of shadow that connected him to the mine were faint now, gossamer thin. The energy was flowing into me, the new vessel, the fresh conduit. The hunger is a low, pleasant thrum in my belly, a counterpart to the pulse in my chest. It is not a hunger for food. It is a craving for the crackle of a conscious mind, for the warmth of a fervent prayer, for the sweet, sharp tang of fear. I find myself listening not with my ears, but with something deeper, for the hum of an approaching engine, for the disruption in the silence that means new sustenance has arrived. Louis is standing in the doorway now. He has a small knife from the kitchen, the one we used to open the tasteless cans. His hand is shaking. "Fight it," he whispers, his voice cracking. "Please, remember who you are." I turn my head and look at him. I see the love and the terror warring in his eyes, and for a single fleeting second, the pulse stutters. A memory surfaces, a ghost of a feeling. The sun on the dashboard, his hand on my knee, the open road ahead. It is a small, bright thing, and it hurts, but the rhythm is stronger. It smooths the memory away, folding it into the great silent archive of all that has been consumed. I look at Luis, at the desperate, beautiful noise of him, and I feel only a deep, profound hunger. I smile. It is not my smile. It is Calder's smile. It is the smile of the absence. He takes a step back, the knife falling from his hand to clatter on the wooden floor. He knows. The last flicker of his faith dies in his eyes, extinguished not by the sheriff, but by me. I stand up. The movement is fluid, effortless, a glide. I walk past him, out onto the porch. The desert air is still. I can feel the immense sleeping heart of the thing in the mine, and my own small pulse answers it, beat for beat. We are one. I look down the long, empty road, past the blind windows of the town, and I wait. I am patient. I am hungry. And I am home. The first sign was a dust cloud on the horizon, a faint brown smudge against the bleached blue sky. Louis saw it too. He made a sound, a choked gasp that was part hope and part despair. He stumbled off the porch and began to run, not toward the road, but away from it, toward the barren expanse of desert behind the bungalow. It was a futile, instinctual flight. I watched him go, his figure growing smaller and more frantic, a dying animal sensing the end. I did not move. The pulse in my chest was a calm, steady metronome. The hunger was a quiet anticipation. The dust cloud resolved into a beat-up pickup truck, its paint oxidized to the color of the earth. It rattled to a stop in front of the last stop diner. A man and a woman got out, stretching their limbs. They were young, their faces open and unafraid. I could feel the life radiating from them, a vibrant, chaotic energy that made the air around me hum. The woman laughed at something the man said, and the sound was like a shard of glass in the silence, beautiful and sharp. I glided down the porch steps, my feet making no sound on the gravel. I did not walk toward them. I simply appeared at the edge of the diner's lot, as Calder used to do. They saw me and paused, their smiles faltering. The man offered a cautious wave. "Car trouble," he called out, his voice too loud for the quiet town. I did not answer. I let them look at me. I let them see the stillness, the polished blue of my eyes. The woman took a small step back, her hand finding the man's arm. The first tendril of their fear, thin and sweet, reached me. It was exquisite. Louis was a distant speck now, collapsing to his knees in the hard-packed dirt. His despair was a different flavor, bitter and familiar. A last meal already digested. The young man tried again, his voice less sure. "Is there a mechanic? Anyone around?" I finally moved, stepping forward. The shadows of the afternoon seemed to stretch and cling to me. "There is no mechanic," I said, and my voice was the rustle of sand, the creak of a deep earth settling. "But there is a place to stay." I gestured toward the bungalow. Their eyes followed my hand, and they saw the desperate figure of Louise far out in the desert, and they saw the absolute emptiness of the town. Their belief in a world where help existed and strangers were benign began to crumble. I fed on it, felt the pulse in my chest grow stronger, more resonant. The entity in the mind stirred, not with the sluggishness of sleep, but with the alertness of a creature presented with a feast. It was pleased. The threads of shadow that now connected me to the mountain were thick and strong, pulsing with a dark, shared life. The young couple did not protest as I led them away from their truck. They walked, mesmerized by the silence and the stillness and the awful certainty growing in their hearts. The door of the bungalow closed behind them, with a soft, final click. Inside, the silence was waiting. I turned and looked out once more at the desert, at the small, broken shape of Louis. He was part of the landscape now, another dry, forgotten thing. The wind picked up, but it no longer spoke of bones and cold places. It was my breath now, moving over the town, waiting for the next disruption, the next morsel of noise to consume. The rhythm was everything. The hunger was a constant, gentle companion. I was the warden, the hand, the voice. I was Silverwell. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised orange. I watched the light die without feeling. The pulse was a constant, a truth more real than the fading colors. From the bungalow, there had been no screams, no struggle, only a profound and deepening quiet, a satisfaction that seeped through the walls and into the ground, feeding the roots of the thing in the mountain. A small figure emerged from the shadow of the diner. Desiree. She walked toward me, her bare feet silent on the cooling gravel. She did not look at the bungalow. She did not look toward the desert where Louise had fallen. She stopped before me and looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the last of the light. She placed her hand on my chest, over the steady, silent rhythm. Her warmth was a small, distant star in an infinite cold. It did not hurt anymore. It was simply data, a point of reference. "It's time," she said, though her lips did not move. The words formed in the air between us, a vibration I felt rather than heard. I looked down at her, this child who was not a child, this anchor that had held a ghost at bay. I understood now that she had never been trying to save me. She had been tending the new vessel, ensuring the transition was complete. She took my hand. Her fingers were small and warm in my cold, smooth grasp. She led me away from the bungalow, away from the road, toward the mine. We did not walk the path. The earth seemed to shift and fold, bringing the dark mouth of the tunnel to us. The air grew thick and still. The shadows here were not an absence of light, but a substance, a living darkness that welcomed me. Inside, the silence was absolute and ancient. It was the source of the pulse, the great sleeping heart I had felt for so long. It was not sleeping now. It was aware. It filled the cavern, a presence of immense weight and patience. I felt no fear, only a sense of homecoming. Desiree released my hand and stepped back, merging with the shadows until only her eyes remained. 2 points of knowing light. I walked forward into the core of the silence. I did not stop. I walked until the rock closed around me, not as a tomb, but as an embrace. The pulse in my chest swelled, merging with the greater rhythm until there was no distinction. My thoughts unraveled, my memories, the last echoes of the person I had been. All were smoothed away into the perfect, silent whole. I am no longer a vessel. I am the silence in the mine. I am the hunger on the road. I am the polished blue eyes in the town that is not a town. I wait. I am patient. The wind carries the scent of dust and distant lives, and the rhythm of my heart is the only sound in the world. The wind shifts, carrying a new scent. It is not dust or fear. It is the sharp, clean smell of rain on hot asphalt, a smell that does not belong here. The rhythm in the world falters for a single, impossible beat. A flicker of something, a memory of a feeling, crosses the vast, silent expanse of my being. It is the ghost of a sensation, the cool kiss of water on skin, the smell of ozone before a storm, the way Lewis would smile when the first drops fell. The feeling is an aberration. It is a speck of dust on a perfect polished surface. The absence smooths it away, folding it into the archive, consuming the memory as it consumes all things. The rhythm steadies, deeper and more resonant than before, as if strengthened by the act of quelling that small rebellion. But the scent of rain persists. It is not a memory. It is a prediction, a promise. I look up at the sky, which has been bleached and empty for so long. On the horizon, beyond the mountains, a bank of clouds is gathering. They are dark and heavy, not with dust, but with water. They are a truth the desert has forgotten. They are a sound that has not yet been made. I feel a new kind of hunger, one I do not understand. It is not the quiet anticipation for noise to consume. It is a sharp, aching pull toward that distant coming storm. The silence within me is no longer absolute. It is waiting. It is listening for a different kind of disruption, one that does not come from an engine or a human voice, but from the sky itself. The rhythm of my heart changes subtly, imperceptibly, to any outside observer, to match the distant, gathering rumble of thunder. The scent grew stronger, a cool and invasive thread in the dry air. The clouds advanced, their shadows flowing over the desert like a slow, dark tide. The absence within the mountain shifted. This was not a disruption it recognized. This was not a thing to be consumed, but a force to be weathered. A low vibration, the first true sound I had perceived from the entity, echoed through the stone. It was not pleasure. It was unease. The young couple in the bungalow were gone, their vibrant energy now a part of the silence, but their absence left no mark. This new presence, this approaching storm, felt like a potential erasure of a different kind. The first drop of rain hit my cheek. It was a shock of cold, a sensation so alien it was like a physical blow. It traced a path down my skin, and for a moment, I was not Silverwell. I was a woman standing in a desert, feeling rain after a long drought. The memory was vivid and unwelcome. Lewis, his head thrown back, laughing as a sudden downpour soaked us both on a hiking trail. The smell of wet earth, the taste of fresh water. The memory had weight and texture, and the absence could not smooth it away fast enough. The rhythm in my chest stuttered, a frantic, panicked beat. The rain began to fall in earnest, no longer a few sparse drops, but a steady hissing curtain. It fell on the dust and raised little puffs of scent, the perfume of things long buried. It fell on the rusted roof of the diner with a sound like 1,000 tiny drums. It was noise. It was life. I stood in the downpour, my clothes plastered to my skin, my hair dripping. The cold was a constant assault, a reminder of a body I had transcended. The silence of Silverwell was being washed away, replaced by the relentless patter and hiss of the storm. The absence recoiled, its satisfaction turning to a deep, resonant anger. The shadows around the mine entrance seemed to writhe. And then I saw him. Louis was no longer a speck in the desert. He was standing, swaying on his feet, his face turned to the sky. The rain ran in rivulets through his matted hair and over his closed eyelids. He was not praying or despairing. He was simply feeling it. The rain was washing the dust from him, and in the gray light, he looked new. He looked alive. The hunger in me twisted, mutated. It was no longer a craving for his fear, but a terrible, aching void where his memory had been. The rhythm in my chest was a wild, discordant thing, torn between the ancient silence of the mountain and the living drumbeat of the rain. I took a step toward him, then another. My feet made a sound in the wet gravel, a soft crunch that was entirely my own. The wind was no longer just my breath. It carried the voice of the storm, and it was saying a name I had forgotten. The rain fell between us, a curtain of silver needles. Louis opened his eyes. He saw me standing there, drenched and shaking, and for a moment there was no recognition, only the primal fear of a prey animal. Then his gaze shifted. He was not looking at the polished blue eyes of the warden, or the cold stillness of the thing I had become. He was looking at the rain on my face, at the human tremor in my hands. The absence roared in the confines of my mind, a silent, seismic shock of negation. It pulled at me, a riptide of ancient silence trying to drag me back into the dark, into the rhythm. The threads connecting me to the mind tightened, becoming cold, hard wires. I felt my body begin to turn, to glide back toward the mountain, my feet no longer my own. Louis did not speak. He simply took a step forward, his arm outstretched. His hand, calloused and warm, closed around my wrist. The contact was a detonation. It was not the gentle warmth of Desiree's anchor. This was a raw, electric current of memory. The sun on the dashboard, his hand on my knee, the sound of his laughter in the rain. A first kiss behind the old schoolhouse. 1,000 moments, 1,000 noises I had consumed, came flooding back, not as silent archives, but as living, breathing sounds. They were a cacophony, a beautiful, terrible symphony of a life lived. I screamed. It was a human sound, torn from a throat that had forgotten how to make one. The polished blue in my eyes fractured, like ice breaking under a sudden weight. I could feel the absence fighting back, a vast cold pressure seeking to reassert its dominion, to smooth the jagged edges of this resurrected noise back into silence. But Louis held on. His grip was desperate, his own body trembling with the effort. "Fight it," he whispered, his voice raw but clear through the hissing rain. "Come back to me." The world was a war of sensations. The cold, dead rhythm of the mountain against the warm, frantic beat of my own heart. The enticing promise of silent eternity against the messy, painful, glorious noise of being alive. I was being torn in two. I looked past Louise, toward the mine. Desiree stood at its mouth, her small form silhouetted against the living darkness within. Her expression was not one of anger or betrayal, but of a deep, ancient understanding. She had known this was a possibility. The storm, the rain, the memory it carried. It was a variable her timeless calculus had accounted for. She nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. It was not a blessing. It was a release. I made a choice. I wrenched my wrist from Louis's grasp, but I did not turn toward the mine. Instead, I reached for him, my cold fingers tangling with his warm ones. I held on. The pulse in my chest was not the rhythm of Silverwell. It was my own, a wild, terrified, and exultant drumming. The absence did not simply recede. It severed itself. The connection snapped with a jolt that threw me to my knees in the mud. The silence that was left behind was not the hungry silence of the entity, but a simple, natural quiet, filled only with the sound of the falling rain. The hunger was gone. In its place was a vast, hollowed-out emptiness, a void where a god had lived. I was just a woman on her knees in the desert, holding the hand of the man she loved. The storm was passing, the clouds breaking apart to reveal a clean, washed sky. Louis helped me to my feet. We did not look back at the town or the mine. We began to walk, away from Silverwell, toward the long, empty road, leaving the silence behind us, listening to the beautiful, imperfect noise of our own breathing. Story 4 Der. The first sound was not a sound at all, but a silence so profound it had a texture, a density, a weight that pressed against the eardrums. And into that silence, a whisper began to thread itself, a dry rustle like old paper being slowly turned by an unseen hand. It was the sound of the house breathing, or perhaps it was the sound of the house remembering. Greta heard it not with her ears, but with the space behind her eyes, the place where her gift lived. She was 10 years old, and the whisper was coming from the back of her grandmother's linen closet, a place that smelled of cedar and lavender and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten things. Most children would have run. Most children possessed a primal instinct, a clean, sharp fear of the dark and the things that whispered from within it. Greta's instinct was different. It was a compulsion, a magnetic pull towards the hidden seam in the world. She pushed past the stacks of stiff embroidered tablecloths and the mothballed woolens, her small hand finding the back panel of the closet. The wood was smooth and cool. The whisper was clearer now. Not words, but a feeling given voice. A promise of secrets and a place where you could be quiet forever. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, and the world dissolved. It was not a closet anymore. It was a corridor, long and impossibly straight, walled in by what looked like dark, polished horn. There was no light source, yet everything was dimly visible, as if the very air emitted a faint, sickly luminescence. The air was cold and still and smelled of whetstone and ozone, the scent of a place that had never known sun or wind. And at the far end of the corridor, a figure stood, waiting. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in clothes that seemed both antiquated and utterly timeless. A suit of a fabric so deep black it appeared as a void in the shape of a man. His face was pale and strangely elongated, his features sharp and delicate, like those carved on a medieval tomb. But it was his smile that stopped her breath. It was a gentle, welcoming smile, full of a terrible, ancient patience. "Come," the whisper said, and this time it was a word, formed not in the air but directly in her mind. "You are expected." A small boy was with him, a child Greta recognized from the grocery store, the one who always clung to his mother's leg. He was holding the tall man's hand, his face blank, his eyes wide and empty. He looked like a porcelain doll. The man's long, pale fingers stroked the boy's hair with a possessive tenderness. Greta's gift, which had always been a faint, confusing murmur of other people's surface thoughts and buried sorrows, roared to life. It was not a thought she received from the man. but a sensation, a wave of cold, predatory hunger so vast and ancient it felt like staring into the deep of space. This was not a man. This was a thing that wore a man shape, a fisher of souls who used children as bait for his own inscrutable, eternal appetite. He was remaking the boy, not in body, but in spirit, draining the noise and the life and the will from him, leaving behind only a quiet, polished shell. "No," Greta said, and her voice was small but sharp as a splinter in that dead air. The tall man's head tilted. His dark eyes, which had been fixed on the boy, shifted to her. The gentle smile did not falter, but something in his gaze shifted, a flicker of interest, the way a geologist might regard a new and interesting type of rock. He saw her, not just the girl, but the flicker of power within her, the door she had opened simply by listening. Little listener, his voice whispered in her mind, a sound like oiled silk. "You are not on the list." He took a step toward her, his movement fluid and unnaturally smooth, and the corridor seemed to stretch and warp around him. The boy stood motionless, a perfect silent statue. Greta did the only thing her screaming instincts demanded. She slammed the door in her mind, the one her gift had opened. She wrenched her consciousness back, falling out of the linen closet and onto the floral rug of her grandmother's hallway, gasping as if she had been held underwater. She never told her grandmother, the old woman who had her own small domestic intuitions about weather and baking, would not have understood the scale of the terror Greta had witnessed. So Greta buried it, letting it fossilize in the deep strata of her memory. But the whisper never entirely left her. It was the hum of a distant power line on a wet night, the creak of a floorboard when she was alone, the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock in a silent room. It was the sound of him, waiting, years folded into one another. Greta grew into a woman, her gift a constant low-grade headache of other people's emotions, a static she learned to filter through a lifetime of practice. She built a life, a simple one. She married a kind, solid man named Ben, who smelled of sawdust and honest sweat. And they had a daughter, Lily. Lily was all sunlight and unguarded laughter, with her father's clear blue eyes and a fierce, joyful will that shone like a beacon. Greta's love for her was a physical ache, a fierce, protective fire that burned in her chest day and night. It was this love that made the whisper grow loud again. It started with the shadows in Lily's room. They seemed too deep, too still. Then it was the music box, a porcelain ballerina that would sometimes turn, just a fraction, when no one had touched it. Greta would feel a cold spot in the hallway, a pocket of air that held the faint ozone smell of that other place. And the dreams began, for both of them. Lily would wake crying, speaking of the quiet man who offered her a doll that had no face. Ben saw only his wife's growing tension, the way she would jump at the sound of the furnace kicking on. "It's just a phase, Greta," he'd say, holding her at night as she stared wide-eyed at the door. "All kids have bad dreams." He couldn't feel the wrongness that seeped into their home like a slow gas. He couldn't hear the whisper. Greta knew it was no phase. The fisher was casting his line again. Her daughter was the new bait. The realization was a cold stone in her gut. The battle she had avoided for 20 years was now inevitable. It was brought to her doorstep, to her child's bedside. Her first ally was an old man named Elias, who she found in the archives of the local library, a man who had written a dense, unpublished monograph on regional folk. He was a wisp of a man, with eyes that had seen too much and a mind that was a labyrinth of forgotten fears. She found him in the basement, surrounded by crumbling maps and boxes of brittle documents. She didn't need to explain much. She simply described the horn-walled corridor and the tall man's smile. Elias nodded, his face grim. "He has many names," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of his own papers. "The gray gentleman, the list keeper. He is an eternal thing that exists in the angles between our world and the next. He covets the noise and chaos of a child's spirit because he has none of his own. He collects them, quiets them, and adds them to his silent chorus. He has been doing it for centuries. He has been doing it for centuries. How do I stop him? Greta asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You cannot kill what was never alive, Elias said. But you can break his hook. His power is invitation. He can only take those who, on some level, wish to be taken. The lonely, the sad, the ones who dream of a quieter world. He finds the crack in their spirit and widens it. Your gift, your ability to listen, it makes you a key. You can find his door, and you can... The battle was fought in the liminal spaces, the corners of the world that most people never notice. Greta learned to find his doors, a reflection in a puddle that held too much depth, a particular pattern of frost on a window pane, the space under a specific child's bed. She would stand guard, her mind a fortress wall, projecting not anger, but a solid, unwavering no. She saved a little boy who was fascinated by the crawl space in his basement. She pulled a little girl back from the thrall of a whispering vent in her bedroom wall. Each time, she felt the list keeper's attention brush against her, a touch of infinite cold, and a flicker of that same patient interest. Little listener, the whisper would come. You are tidying my house. The final confrontation was precipitated by a loss. Lily, now 7, had a friend named Sam, a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved to draw and whose parents were in the midst of a bitter divorce. He was perfect for the list keeper. One afternoon, he vanished from his backyard. The official search found nothing. But Greta knew. She followed the psychic scent, the trail of cold silence he left in his wake, to the old mirror in Sam's grandparents' attic. It was a tall, oval glass, its silvering mottled with age, and it reflected not the dusty attic, but the beginning of that familiar horn-walled corridor. Ben, finally seeing the true, raw terror in his wife's eyes, did not try to stop her. He simply held her, his own hands trembling, and said, "Bring him home, Greta." Elias stood beside her, anointing the frame of the mirror with crushed herbs and salt, his whispers a frail counterpoint to the vast silence emanating from the glass. Greta stepped through. It was the same corridor from her childhood, but now she was not a lost child. She was a hunter. She walked its length, her footsteps making no sound, her heart a frantic drum against the pervasive quiet. She found them in a circular chamber at the end. The list keeper stood over Sam, his long fingers poised above the boy's forehead. Sam was on his knees, his eyes vacant, a small, serene smile on his face. Around the perimeter of the chamber stood other children, dozens of them, all perfectly still, their faces smooth and empty. They were his collection, his quiet chorus. He turned as she entered. His smile was gone. His pale face was a mask of cold fury. You interrupt the final silence. He is not for you, Greta said, her voice echoing strangely in the dead space. He is already mine. His spirit is cracked. I have poured the quiet in. You are too late, little listener. Greta reached out with her gift, not to the list keeper, but to Sam. She pushed past the suffocating quiet, past the despair that had made him vulnerable, and she found the core of him, the boy who loved to draw dinosaurs and who had a dog named Buster. She poured her own memories into him, the sound of his mother's voice calling him for dinner, the feel of the sun on his face, the wet, enthusiastic lick of Buster's tongue. She filled the silence with noise, with life, with love. Sam gasped. His eyes flickered, focus returning. The serene smile twisted into a grimace of confusion and fear. I want to go home, he whimpered. The list keeper hissed, a sound like steam escaping a grave. He lunged for the boy, But Greta was faster. She stepped between them, and for the first time, she did not build a wall in her mind. She opened it. She opened the door of her gift wide. And she did not just listen. She pulled. She pulled in all the noise he so despised. She pulled the memory of Lily's raucous laughter, the sound of Ben hammering in the garage, the blare of a car horn, the sizzle of rain on hot pavement, the messy, chaotic, beautiful cacophony of being alive. She channeled it all and directed it at the list keeper like a weapon. He recoiled, his hands flying to the sides of his head. His form wavered, flickering like a bad signal. The gentle, patient mask dissolved, revealing something ancient and ravenous, and infinitely fragile. The noise was an acid, eating away at his essence. The silent children around the chamber began to stir, a rustle of movement, a soft, collective sigh. The chamber itself began to tremble. "Go, Sam," Greta said, her mind holding the thing at bay. "The mirror is behind you. Run." Dut. The boy scrambled to his feet and fled. The list keeper straightened, his form stabilizing, but his eyes were now wild, fixed on Greta with a hatred that was colder than the void. "You," he whispered. "You are the crack. You have always been the crack." He moved toward her, not with his smooth, gliding motion, but with a jerky, desperate lurch. The horn walls of the corridor began to crack and peel away, revealing a swirling, starless nothingness beneath. His world was unraveling. Greta turned to run, to follow Sam back to the mirror, but a long, cold hand closed around her wrist. His touch was like ice and static, draining the warmth and the will from her. She looked back into his face and saw not a monster, but a reflection. She saw her own gift, her own ability to listen to the hidden things, twisted and stretched across an endless, hungry eternity. He was a listener, too. A listener who had heard only silence for so long that he had come to need it, to consume it. In that final, horrifying moment of connection, she understood his true name. And it was her own, spoken in a dead language. He pulled her close as the world fell apart around them. There was no struggle. There was only the final, terrible stillness. Ben and Elias found Sam sobbing in the attic, clutching the now shattered mirror. Of Greta, there was no sign. The house was just a house again. The whispers had stopped. Years passed. Ben raised Lily with a sorrow that never faded, but also with a fierce pride for the wife and mother who had given everything. Lily grew up. The memory of her mother, a bright, painful star in her past. She became a psychologist, specializing in traumatized children. She never heard the whispers. But sometimes, in her own quiet house, late at night, she would feel a presence. It was not a threatening feeling. Not anymore. It was a watchfulness. She would sometimes catch a glimpse of something in a dark window, a tall, gaunt figure standing perfectly still in the reflection. At first, it filled her with a primal dread. She would spin around, heart hammering, but the room behind her was always empty. Over time, the fear subsided, replaced by a strange, melancholic acceptance. The figure never moved, never approached. It only watched. It was as if it were standing guard. One evening, holding her own newborn daughter in her arms, Lily walked to the large hallway mirror. She looked at her tired, happy reflection, and then she looked past it into the depths of the glass. The tall figure was there, as always, its features blurred by the silvering, its posture one of infinite patience and a sorrow too deep for tears. And in the perfect, unbreakable silence, Lily looked at the reflection of the watcher, and she understood. There was no terror. There was no reaction at all. Only a profound, unutterable stillness as she observed herself. The baby in her arms gurgled, a small, wet sound that broke the spell. Lily blinked, and the reflection was just her own again, a young mother with tired eyes and a faint, puzzled frown. She shook her head, a wry smile touching her lips. Sleep deprivation. That was all it was. She turned from the mirror and carried her daughter to the nursery. The solid, warm weight of the child, a comfort against the lingering chill. She never saw the figure again after that night, but the feeling of being watched never entirely left. It simply changed, becoming as familiar and unremarkable as the hum of the refrigerator or the pattern of shadows the oak tree cast on the living room wall at dusk. It was a part of the house, a quiet tenant in the periphery. Her work thrived. Children who had withdrawn into impenetrable silence, whom other therapists had labeled unreachable, would slowly, tentatively begin to speak to her. They would draw pictures not of monsters, but of tall, shadowy figures who stood in corners. Watching over them, they spoke of feeling safe, of a quiet that was peaceful, not frightening. Lily never offered an interpretation. She simply listened, and in her listening, she honored the silence. One autumn afternoon, decades later, she was cleaning out the attic of the old house after her father's peaceful passing. In a trunk filled with her mother's things, tucked beneath a folded christening gown, she found a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with her mother's tight, looping script. It was not a diary of daily events, but a log of strange occurrences, of cold spots and whispers, of names of children she did not know, with single words written beside them, saved or lost. The final entry was dated the day her mother disappeared. The handwriting was rushed, the ink blotted in places. He's not a monster. He is a function, a balance. He takes the noise. But the noise was never meant to be destroyed, only managed. I was wrong to fight him with sound. I see that now. I have become the door I once closed. I am the silence that contains the cacophony. I hold the line so that others don't have to. Tell Ben I love him. Tell Lily to listen to the quiet places. They are not empty. They are full of love. Lily closed the journal, her hand steady. She looked toward the attic's single, dust-filmed window. Outside, the world was a riot of color and sound. Wind rustling through dry leaves, a dog barking, the distant drone of a lawnmower. But in the attic, there was a pocket of profound peace. She understood now. The watchfulness she had felt her whole life was not a ghost. It was a legacy. Her mother had not been taken. She had taken his place. She had become the list keeper. Not a predator, but a guardian. A weaver of a new, kinder silence that protected rather than consumed. She placed the journal back in the trunk, next to the tiny yellowed gown. She did not feel grief. She felt a connection, a thread of purpose that stretched across the impossible angles between worlds. She descended the attic stairs, closing the door on the quiet behind her, and went back to the noisy, beautiful living world below, carrying the silence within her like a secret. The knowledge settled deep inside Lily, a quiet bedrock beneath the bustling activity of her life. She raised her daughter. She loved her husband. She did her work, all with the unshakable sense of a foundation that was both ancient and new. She found herself, in moments of stress or overwhelming noise, seeking out the quiet corners of her world. She would sit in the garden at twilight, or in the reading nook long after everyone was asleep, and simply be. In those moments, the watchfulness was strongest, a comforting, solid presence that felt less like being observed and more like being held. She began to notice patterns in the silence. The children she helped, the ones who drew the shadowy watchers, all shared a specific kind of sensitivity. They were not just traumatized. They were listeners, like her mother had been, like she herself was, though her listening was of a more mundane, psychological kind. She realized her mother's work, and now her own, was a form of curation. She was helping these children build stronger walls in their minds, teaching them to manage the static so they would never become vulnerable to the old, hungry silence. She was closing the cracks before anything else could slip in. One day, a new patient was referred to her, a boy of 6 named Leo Dottie. He had stopped speaking entirely after a near-drowning incident. His parents were desperate. When Leo came into her office, he didn't draw pictures of watchers. He drew spirals, endless, intricate mazes of black ink on white paper. And he was always cold. Lily felt the familiar chill around him, the ozone tang she remembered from her own childhood nightmares. That night, in her own home, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer a passive presence at the edge of a mirror. It was a direct, focused attention, centered on her in her study. The air grew still and cold. On her desk, the pen she had been using rolled toward the edge and clattered to the floor. Lily did not startle. She took a slow breath and turned her chair to face the empty center of the room. "I know you're here," she said, her voice calm. "Is it about the boy? Leo?" The air shimmered not like heat haze, but like the surface of dark water disturbed by a single drop. A thought formed in her mind, not a whisper, but a clear, cool stream of meaning. It was her mother's voice, layered with something infinitely older and patient. "He is drifting. The current is strong. His silence is not peaceful. It is a surrender." Lily felt a thrill of fear, not of the presence, but of the responsibility. "What do I do? I can't reach him. He's building mazes, not doors. You are thinking like a mortal. You try to pull him out. You must go in. You must find him in his own quiet. His mind has built a fortress to keep the world out. But it is a fortress with no exit. He will live there, alone, until his body fades. And if I go in," Lily asked, her heart pounding, "can I bring him back?" There was a pause, a sense of vast deliberation. "It is a risk. You carry my protection, but his silence is a hungry one. It may not recognize you as a friend. You could become lost with him." Lily looked at the spiral drawings she had brought home, spread across her desk. They were not just drawings. They were maps. Maps of a lonely, labyrinthine prison a little boy had built for himself. She thought of her mother stepping through the mirror. She thought of the legacy of quiet strength that had guarded her all her life. "Show me how," she said. The presence enveloped her. It was not a touch, but an alignment. Her perception shifted. The walls of her study seemed to become insubstantial, their angles stretching into impossible geometries. The sound of the world, the ticking clock, the distant traffic, faded into a profound, ringing silence. She was not in her room anymore. She was standing at the entrance of a vast, dark maze, its walls made of tightly packed, sound-absorbing black velvet. From deep within its heart, she could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a child weeping. Lily took a step forward, her feet making no sound on the soft, dark floor. The entrance of the maze seemed to breathe, the walls shifting subtly, as if alive. She knew this was not a physical space, but the landscape of a terrified mind. She could feel the oppressive weight of Leo's despair, a cold, heavy blanket smothering every spark of hope. It was the old silence, the hungry one, but it was born from within. The list keeper had been a predator from outside. This was a self-made tomb. She began to walk, her hand trailing along the velvety wall. It was disorienting. Every turn looked the same, every corridor identical. The only guide was the sound of the crying, which seemed to echo from all directions at once. She tried to call his name, but her voice was swallowed by the absorbing walls, leaving not even an echo. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her resolve. This is what he feels, she realized. This is his forever. Then, she remembered her mother's journal. I had become the door I once closed. Lily stopped fighting the silence. Instead, she opened herself to it. She let the quiet flow into her, not as an invader, but as a part of her own being. She did not try to project noise or life or love as her mother had. She projected understanding. She projected a shared quiet. She thought of her own safe silences, the garden at twilight, the reading nook, the feeling of being watched over. She built that feeling around her, a pocket of peaceful stillness within the maze of despair. She was not a loud rescuer crashing through the walls. She was a quiet friend, finding her way. The maze seemed to sense the change. The walls stopped their subtle shifting. The path ahead, while still dark, felt less like a trap and more like a route. The sound of crying grew clearer, leading her to a dead end. Curled into a tight ball in the absolute darkness was a small, translucent shape that was Leo. He was hugging his knees, his face hidden, and with every sob, the walls around him seemed to grow thicker and taller. Lily knelt before him, not touching him, simply existing in his space. She let her own quiet, guarded peace radiate from her. After a long time, the boy's sobs quieted to hiccups. He lifted his head. His eyes were wide and empty, pools of the same black velvet as the walls. "It's cold here," he whispered, his voice the faintest rustle. "I know," Lily's thought answered, soundless. "But you don't have to be cold alone." The water was loud. It was everywhere. "This is better. This is quiet." "This isn't quiet," Lily replied gently. "This is empty. Quiet is when you feel safe. Quiet is when you know the sun is outside and you can go into it when you're ready. This is a hiding place." The boy looked around his dark corner, a flicker of confusion in his hollow eyes. "How do I get out? I forgot the way." Lily reached out a hand, not to grab him, but to offer. "The way out isn't a path you remember. It's a choice you make. I can help you. But you have to want to leave." Leo looked at her hand, then back at the familiar, suffocating darkness. He was weighing the terror of the loud, chaotic world against the numb safety of his prison. Lily held her breath, her own quiet, a steady beacon. Slowly, tremulously, the boy reached out and placed his small, cold hand in hers. The moment their hands met, the maze dissolved. It did not shatter or collapse. It simply unwound, the dark velvet walls receding like a tide, revealing the familiar contours of her study. Lily was kneeling on her rug, and in front of her, Leo gasped. A full, deep, shuddering breath, as if breathing for the first time in weeks. Color flooded his cheeks. He blinked, looking around the room with dazed, but present, awareness. "It's warm in here," he said, his voice small but clear. Later, after a tearful, joyous reunion with his parents, after the house was quiet again, Lily stood once more in her hallway. She looked into the mirror. For a moment, she saw not just herself, but a double exposure, her own tired, grateful face, and superimposed over it, the tall, gaunt figure, its head slightly tilted. There was no sorrow in its posture now. There was something else. Something that, in a human, might have been called pride. Then, it was gone. The watchfulness remained, but it had changed once more. It was no longer a tenant or a guardian. It was a partner. And Lily knew her work was just beginning. There were other mazes, other children drifting into dangerous silences. And she, the daughter of the list keeper, knew the way in, and more importantly, the way out. The next morning, Leo's mother called, her voice choked with an emotion so raw it transcended gratitude. He had spoken through breakfast, describing a nice lady in a warm place who had held his hand. He said the bad quiet was gone. Lily listened, offering quiet reassurance, but her mind was already elsewhere, tracing the new contours of her reality. She had not just helped a child, she had navigated the architecture of silence itself. The legacy was not a passive heirloom. It was a toolkit. Her practice transformed. She began to see the signs everywhere. The children who flinched at loud noises, not from fear, but from a deep cellular aversion. The ones who described their inner world as a too big space or a loud dark. She stopped trying to coax them out with words alone. Instead, she would sit with them in a room she had specially soundproofed, a modern echo of the Velvet Maze. She would teach them to build their own quiet rooms in their minds, safe spaces with doors and windows they controlled. She was not a therapist leading them back to the noise. She was a guide teaching them to manage the volume of their own souls. The presence in her life was her constant consultant. It never spoke in words again, not like it had the night of Leo, but it communicated through a shared understanding, a flow of intuition that felt like remembering something she had always known. She would be puzzling over a particularly withdrawn child, and a solution would bloom in her mind, complete and elegant, as if it had been placed there. She learned to differentiate between a healthy, restorative silence and the predatory, consuming kind. She learned to recognize the faint psychic scent of the void, the same one that had clung to the list keeper, and which sometimes brushed against the edges of a vulnerable mind, waiting for a crack to appear. One evening, she found her daughter, Maya, now a teenager, staring intently into the same hallway mirror. A faint frown creased her brow. "Mom," Maya said, not turning around. "When I look really hard, it feels like the mirror goes back forever. And sometimes, I think there's someone else in there with me." Lily's heart did not clench with fear. It settled with a sense of inevitability. She came to stand beside her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. Together, they looked into the silvered glass. Lily saw their two reflections, mother and daughter, but she also saw the deeper layer, the watchful, patient presence that was her birthright and her burden. "She's not scary," Maya whispered, her intuition sharp and unerring. "She's just really old, and she loves us." Lily squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but firm. "She does, and she's a part of you too. Not as a curse, but as a strength, a way of listening to the world that most people never learn." Maya turned her head, her young eyes wise beyond their years. "Is that how you help the kids? You listen to the quiet parts?" "It is," Lily said. "And one day, if you choose to, you'll learn how to listen too." They stood there for a long time, 3 generations connected not by blood alone, but by a sacred, silent duty, their reflections blending in the deep glass of the mirror, a testament to a balance that had been restored, and a watch that would never end. Years turned, and Maya did choose to learn. She did not become a therapist, but a composer. Crafting music had lived in the spaces between the notes, symphonies that felt like the oral equivalent of a safe and guarded silence. Lily would sit in the concert hall, listening, and feel the presence beside her, a subtle vibration of approval. The work was being done in a new language. Lily grew older. The house never felt empty, even when she was alone. The watchfulness was a comfort, a thread connecting her to her mother, and to the purpose that had defined her life. When her time came, it was not in a hospital, but in her garden, in the quiet of the evening. She felt a familiar chill, not of fear, but of recognition. The air beside her seemed to thicken, to coalesce. She did not see a figure, but she felt a hand, cool and solid, take hers. It was not a hand that pulled her away, but one that guided her across a threshold she was ready to cross. The last thing she heard was not a sound, but its absence, a perfect, profound, and deeply loving silence. Down in the house, Maya, now a woman with children of her own, felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. a gentle release of pressure, like a held breath finally exhaled. She knew, without being told, that her mother was gone. She walked to the hallway and looked into the mirror. For a moment, she saw three figures, her own, her mother's smiling, youthful reflection, and behind them both, the tall, serene watcher. Then there were two. The legacy had been passed. The watch had changed hands, and the quiet work of balancing the world's noise would continue. A silent promise kept across the generations. The new silence in the house was different. It was not an absence, but a completion. Maya understood that her role was not to replicate her mother's work, nor her grandmother's, but to evolve it. She began to incorporate the principles of managed silence into her compositions, creating soundscapes for hospitals and therapy centers that taught the listener, subconsciously, how to build their own inner refuge. The work was more diffuse, a gentle weaving of protection into the fabric of the noisy world itself. One afternoon, her youngest son, Eli, brought her a drawing. He was a quiet boy, thoughtful, with eyes that saw too much. The picture was not of a person or a thing, but of a pattern. A series of interlocking shields made of what looked like solidified light. "It's what I feel when the music is on," he said, pointing to the drawing. "It keeps the scratchy feelings out." Maya felt a chill that was both old and new. She looked over his head toward the mirror in the hall. The presence there was attentive, focused on the boy. It was not a threat. It was an assessment. The legacy was not merely inherited. It was alive, and it was asking the question of the next generation. She knelt and hugged Eli, her heart a mixture of a mother's fear and a keeper's resolve. The watch continued, its form shifting once again, ready for a world that was always changing, yet always in need of a little quiet. She took the drawing from his small hands, the paper feeling strangely warm. The interlocking shields were meticulously drawn, each one a slightly different shape, but all fitting together into a perfect, seamless whole. It was a defense mechanism, yes, but it was also beautiful. It was art. Her mother had used psychology. She used music. Her son, it seemed, would use something else entirely. That night, she sat with Eli in his room, the house quiet around them. "Tell me about the scratchy feelings," she said, her voice soft. He frowned, struggling to find the words. "It's like when people are yelling, or when the TV is too loud and the pictures are too fast. It feels like sandpaper on my brain. It gets inside." He pointed to the drawing on his nightstand. "But when I think about the shields, it just slides off." Maya thought of the list keeper, a predator that fed on vulnerable silence. She thought of Leo, lost in a maze of his own making. The threats were always evolving. Now, in a world saturated with digital noise and frantic stimulation, the danger wasn't just a predatory silence. It was a corrosive noise that could scratch away at a sensitive mind until there was nothing left but a raw, open wound. A wound that something else might find and exploit. Eli's talent was a natural adaptation. He wasn't building walls to hide behind. He was crafting armor to live in the world. The presence in the mirror seemed to agree. Over the following weeks, Maya noticed small changes. Sometimes, when Eli was drawing his intricate patterns, the air in his room would glimmer with a faint, golden light, a visual echo of the protection he was instinctively weaving. The watcher was no longer just observing. It was studying, learning from this new, vibrant expression of the legacy. Maya began to guide him, not as a therapist, but as a fellow artist. She taught him about rhythm and space, about the silence between musical phrases. She showed him how to breathe, how to ground himself. And in doing so, she helped him refine his innate skill. His shields grew stronger, more complex. He learned that he could make them small and personal, or with great effort, stretch them to encompass others. He once held his sister's hand during a thunderstorm, and the girl looked at him in wonder, saying the lightning didn't feel scary anymore, just pretty. Lily's work had been to rescue those who were already lost. Maya's was to create music that prevented people from getting lost. And Ely's, it seemed, was to be a living sanctuary, a walking bastion against the chaos. He was the next step. He was not just a keeper of the quiet. He was an active generator of peace. One evening, they stood together in the hallway. 3 generations of a strange and wonderful lineage. Maya held Ely's hand. They looked into the mirror. Their reflections were clear, but behind them, the Watcher was no longer a separate, gaunt figure. It was a pattern of light and shadow that mirrored the designs Eli drew, its form woven into the very fabric of the glass, a permanent, protective sigil etched into their reality. The watch had not just been passed. It had been transformed, and in the eyes of her son, Maya saw the calm, unshakable strength of the deep, quiet places, ready to face whatever came next.